Hello, it's that time of the year again, and can you believe that year 3 of Plainy D is over? As a kind of tradition on this channel, I've rolled all of the last 12 months of video into this one upload, so you can sit back, relax and listen to me in extended play. Kind of like a plainly difficult omnibus. Thank you all for your support and interaction with the channel. I really enjoy making content for you all, and it's amazing how you have helped Plainly Difficult grow into what it is today. Today's video was suggested to me by Tim, one of my Patreons. I can't thank you enough for your support. On the 1st of July 1940, the world's third largest suspension bridge was open to the public, but within 3 months would be just a pile of twisted metal and concrete. You might be thinking that it was some kind of espionage in the lead up to the US joining the Second World War. Well, if you did, unfortunately you'd be wrong, as the cause was a minor design flaw and an unfortunate gust of wind. Okay, it wasn't as simple as that, but the lessons learnt would influence every large structure built afterwards. Ever since 1889, there has been a need for a connection between Tacoma and the Kitsap Peninsula in Washington state. Originally, the idea of a trestle bridge was floated by the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, but the plan didn't come to fruition. A more serious plan was put forward in 1923, with the Chamber of Commerce attempting to find financing for the project. During the initial stages of gaining support, the appointed Washington State Toll Bridge Authority found that a crossing bridge would not be able to cover the costs of construction from collecting tolls alone. Once again, the project looked like it could not go ahead. However, the nearby Puget Sound Naval Yard and Fort Lewis, run by the Navy and Army respectively, showed great interest in the crossing. Backed by the armed forces, the toll authority requested $13 million from the federal government to design and build a crossing, and engineer Clark Eldridge was appointed to design a preliminary concept for a suspension bridge, which would feature 7.6 metre deep trusses to stiffen the underside of the roadway. However, another engineer, Leon Moiseff, veteran of the Golden Gate Bridge project, proposed a much cheaper and sleeker design. Leon's idea would use much smaller road trusses of only 2.4 metres. This would reduce the cost of the bridge from around 11 million down to a much more affordable 8 million. The strength of the cables was thought to be able to offset the wind pressure on the bridge, and in doing so transfer the stress to the anchor. The bridge would have a span of 850 metres, making it the third largest suspension bridge in the world. Even though the bridge was rather long, it was only predicted to have light traffic flow, and due to this the design only allowed for a 12 metre narrow 2-lane roadway. As well as being narrow, the roadway was also very shallow due to the cheaper to construct 2.4 metre trusses. It was these seemingly minor but visually appealing design decisions would cause problems for the bridge's short life due to flexibility of the roadway. As with most government dealings, the cheaper bid got the contract. The Public Works Administration approved $6 million for the construction project, with the remaining balance of $8 million to be collected from toll crossings after completion. With a go-ahead given and Moiseff's design planned out, construction works began on the 27th of September 1938. The construction project took 19 months and at a cost of $6.4 million. Even as the project was being built, stability issues due to the shallow roadway caused workers to dub the bridge Galloping Gertie, as she swayed in even mild winds. The bridge twisted opposite sides of the centre span as the overly flexible roadway danced in the wind. Even before opening day, the bridge began to become infamous for its unwanted vertical movement. On the 1st of July 1940, Galloping Gertie was open to the public. As the first vehicles navigated the bridge, noticeable bouncing could be seen. Quickly she became a tourist attraction as the public came to see the bridge bounce around as people timidly crossed the span. Due to the entertaining experience of the bridge, many film cameras captured the new building's bizarre behaviours. Several attempts to design out the unwanted movement were implemented by attaching cables to the bridge attached to 50-ton concrete blocks. However, the cables to the blocks snapped soon after installation. Another set of cables were installed, although this time they didn't snap, but still proved ineffective. The bridge also had hydraulic buffers installed where the towers met the roadway, but again these had little effect to the unwanted movement. Gathering winds from the southwest on the morning of the 7th of November 1940 started to create oscillations. Gradually the bridge flexed as it had done before as the winds reached 38 miles per hour at 7:30 am. But after each movement the roadway bobbled higher and higher up to heights of 5 feet as it caught in the wind. Clark Eldridge, one of the original bridge designers, drove across the bridge at 8:30 en route to his office. By 9:30 the winds hit 42 miles an hour and scientist Professor F.B. Farquharson arrived at the bridge. Within 2 hours the bridge would be in ruins. Now Mr. Farquharson is worth mentioning here as he had been employed to try and tackle the Galloping Gertie once and for all, and he was only days away from fixing the bridge. It was discovered during experiments in a wind tunnel that the weak roadway and poor aerodynamic properties were the cause of the oscillation. Frederick Farquharson proposed on the 2nd of November 2 fixes. One would include cutting holes in the roadway girders to allow air to pass through, eliminating the unwanted movement. This was not favoured by the Toll Bridge Authority as it was permanent and a destructive fix. As an alternative and less invasive fix, Farquharson proposed fitting fairings to the side of the bridge to help airflow around the roadway, much like a wing, but time had run out. Back to the fateful day, and the professor tasked with fixing the bridge could only stand by and watch as the structure swayed uncontrollably in the wind. He set up a motion picture camera to capture the unfolding disaster. For the next half an hour leading up to 10 am, the last few cars braved the bridge and paid their tolls. 2 more vehicles would attempt to traverse the bridge, a delivery van from the Rapid Transfer Company and a car. Neither would complete their journey. The transfer van would be toppled over by the West Tower, with its driver and passenger escaping on foot. The car, driven by Leonard Coatsworth, a news editor for the Tacoma News Tribune, and his daughter's dog Tubby, managed to get as far as the East Tower when a jolt from the bridge threw the car into the curb. Coatsworth escaped and started crawling towards the East Tower. Eventually he made it to the safety of the toll plaza and told a member of staff about his dog, and then contacted the office, which in turn dispatched one of their photographers to capitalise on the unfolding disaster. Eldridge arrived at the scene at 10:15 am after receiving a phone call saying the bridge was about to go. By 10:30, parts of the bridge were starting to fall off. Some workmen managed to save the 2 from the toppled van. As the wind started to lull, one of the photographers from the News Tribune, Howard Clifford, braved his way onto the bridge to try and rescue the dog Tubby stranded inside Coatsworth's car, but he couldn't get close enough. Farquharson, who was still taking photos, decided to try to reach the car at 10:55 am to rescue the dog. He opened the doors to find a terrified Tubby, who then went to bite Farquharson's finger. Unsuccessful, he retreated back to safety. At 10 am, larger and larger bits of concrete were launched into the air as the bridge ripped itself to pieces. Steel girders bent like rubber, bolts shot off like bullets in all directions as suspension cables whipped around like a fishing line. As the building tore itself to shreds, hundreds gathered to watch the destruction firsthand. At 11:02, the bridge finally gave out, and a 182-metre stretch broke free, falling into the Puget below. Cables cracked through the air and sparks spat out from damaged electrical wiring. Farquharson on the East Tower scrambled for his life, reaching the toll plaza as several sections plunged into the water. Coatsworth's stranded car, with Tubby still inside, disappeared into the Narrows, never to be seen again. By 11:10 am, it was all over, with the East and West Towers standing with only disfigured cables dangling along the once grand centre span of the bridge. In the aftermath, an inquiry was set up to understand the cause of the collapse, and to find who was at fault for such an embarrassing demise of a publicly funded project. Eldridge was quick to point the finger at the moneylenders for using a cheaper design, and pointed out that he had opposed Moisseff's design due to the 2.4-metre girders acting like sails in the wind, telling newspapers the men who held the purse strings were the whip crackers for the entire project. We had a tried and true conventional bridge design. We were told we couldn't have the necessary money without using plans furnished from an Eastern firm of engineers, chosen by the moneylenders. The Public Works Administration officials claimed that they had heard no such objections from the engineering team about the bridge's design. However, barely 2 months had passed before one of the administration's own engineers, David Glenn, blew the whistle to say that he had refused to approve the bridge in July 1940, even submitting a report rejecting the bridge for use, citing fatal design flaws. The PWA and the Toll Authority ignored the report and accepted the completed structure. 2 weeks after Glenn came forward, he was fired from the PWA. The Federal Works Administration appointed a panel of 3 engineers to investigate the collapse. No single person was blamed, but instead highlighted 3 causes for the incident. The first being the bridge's flexibility due to the relatively small support girders. The second issue was the roadway deck acting like an aerofoil, causing lift and drag, which was the reason for the twisting motion. Finally, the engineer's lack of understanding of the potential aerodynamic capabilities of a bridge, which could have been solved by wind tunnel testing of potential design. Chief designer Liam Mossef was let off the hook, however his career was in tatters, and the shambles of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge would shadow him for the rest of his life until his death in 1943. Eldridge was not so forgiving, scolding Mossef for designing a bridge for no more than $7 million, in doing so undercutting the original, more thicker girded, expensive design. Soon after, Eldridge would quit his job and start working for the US Navy on the island of Guam. Bizarrely, he would be captured by the Japanese during World War II, and whilst in a POW camp, would be recognised by one of the Japanese officers who had studied in the US, who in turn approached Eldridge only to say Tacoma Bridge. Controversially, not all the money for the bridge could be recovered from the insurers straight away, as it was claimed that the towers and cables could be reused, and because of this the underwriters offered a meagre $1.8 million. Unsurprisingly, the state filed a dispute trying to recover at least $4.3 million. After a 9-month battle, both sides agreed on a payout of $4 million. This delay stopped any project for a replacement in its tracks as the US entered the Second World War. A second bridge would be built after the war, opening in 1950, and would closely resemble the original design by Eldridge. And Farquharson would play a part in the new bridge's design with his testing of scale models in wind tunnels. Many lessons were learnt from the first Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse, helping to improve design and construction of all suspension bridges built since. And it was lucky to have only had a death toll of 1, poor old Tubby the dog. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks again for Tim for suggesting this subject. Please help the channel grow by liking, commenting, subscribing and also sharing. Also keep up to date with new videos by hitting the bell icon. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. This subject was suggested to me and I thought it was too interesting to pass up, so I paused what I was doing and started to focus on this. Thank you for the suggestion. It is likely that you may have discovered my channel from one of my nuclear disaster videos. This story is most definitely not the deadliest I've covered in terms of environmental impact, however it deserves to be remembered, as it was the only nuclear reactor incident in the US that resulted in immediate deaths, with one of the fatalities being impaled by a shielding plug to the ceiling. The SL-1 was an experimental nuclear reactor and stood for Stationary Low Power Reactor No. 1. The idea for the reactor was part of a series of experimental nuclear power plants for use in remote radar outposts in the Arctic, where the only power source had been from diesel generators. The Army had been evaluating their use of diesel generators between 1954 and 1955 and decided on a more effective replacement. The Army Reactors Branch contacted the Argonne National Laboratory, who had a proven track record in reactor development on the Manhattan Project, to design, build and test a prototype reactor. The Army had set out a shopping list of requirements for their new low-power reactor. Some of the more important attributes were simple and reliable, easy to build, operable in the harsh Arctic environment, must be air transportable, all components limited to package sizes measuring 2.2 by 2.7 by 6 metres, and no heavier than 9.1 kilos, to use minimal proprietary parts, and finally, each core loading to have a 3-year life cycle. The prototype would be built at the National Reactor Testing Station in Idaho Falls, Idaho, which was pretty isolated, with ground being broken in July 1957. After a year almost to the day, July 1958 saw the construction complete and going critical in August and finally up and running in November, with it formally being opened on the 2nd of December. The reactor was held within a 15-metre high cylindrical building made out of 1/4-inch steel and was known as ARA 602, with a condenser fan room near the top of the building. Access to the plant was via a door through an enclosed stairwell from ARA 603, the support building. There was an emergency exit leading out to external stairs to ground level. The reactor was embedded in gravel at the bottom. The building didn't have the same protections as a plant in a built-up area, but it was thought that any incident could be contained within the main structure. The reactor would use a boiling water design and used 93.2% highly enriched uranium fuel, which would use light water in a natural circulation cycle for cooling. The water system flowed through fuel plates of uranium-aluminium alloy under a pressure of 300 pounds per square inch. The reactor was built to house 59 fuel assemblies, 1 source and 9 control rods. However, in general operation, it only used 40 fuel and 5 control components. Many of the blank spaces used dummy rods, which were later fitted with test sensors. After testing, the reactor was handed over to the Army for operation and training experience, and Combustion Engineering Incorporated working as the lead contractor from February 1958. Many different personnel would train on the reactor from both military and civilian organisations, with the plant operated by true crew members with CEI staff monitoring any developments, being able to step in as necessary. As the reactor aged, boron strips corroded and flaked off, and by 1960 the CEI had calculated that 18% had been lost within the core of the reactor. In November 1960, cadmium sheets were added to try and bolster the corroded boron. Leading up to the Christmas on the 21st of December 1960, the reactor was shut down for maintenance for 11 days. During this time, the instruments were recalibrated and extra auxiliary components were installed. Flux wires were also installed. These were used to monitor the neutron flux levels within the core. On the 3rd of January 1961, the reactor was being readied by a 3-man team in preparation for it to be brought back online. Each man was in their 20s and consisted of Army Specialist John A. Byrons, Richard Leroy McKinley, and Navy Seabee Construction Electrician, First Class, Richard C. Legg. As the team worked on the reactor, 2 false fire alerts would be triggered, both of which were responded to by the fire department. Part of the maintenance process meant that the main control rod in the centre of the core had to be withdrawn manually to be reconnected to its drive mechanism. As the evening drew in, all 3 men were inside the reactor room, with Byrons and McKinley at the side and Legg standing on top of the structure supervising the movement of the control rod. At 9:01 in the evening, John Byrons withdrew the control rod too far, and within 4 milliseconds the rod became critical, instantly creating enough heat to melt the fuel within the core, vaporising it. As the heat caused the fuel to expand, a pressure wave was ejected out of the reactor, creating a water hammer, which in turn lifted the whole reactor 2.77 metres in the air. Richard Legg, who was standing on top of the structure, became impaled to the ceiling by one of the shield plugs, which had been travelling at a speed of 26 metres a second. A high-pressure spray of radioactive steam water hit the 2 men who had been working to the side of the reactor, killing Byrons instantly and severely injuring McKinley. From the control rod going critical to complete destruction only took between 2 and 4 seconds. Another fire alarm for the day was sounded and a slightly annoyed fire crew of 6 men turned up. At first it seemed like another false alarm with the main building intact from the outside, with only a little bit of steam emanating from the roof. However, as the crew moved towards the building and upon entering the stairwell, they found their radiation gauges were going haywire. The fire crew immediately retreated and after consulting with a doctor made a plan of spending no more than a minute for each person inside the structure to limit the exposure. Initially, 1 crew member and a health physicist wearing protective equipment and gas masks attempted to enter the building, However, they withdrew after seeing 25 rotogens on their radiation meters. At 10:30 p.m, a supervisor working for the contractor CEI and the head health physicist arrived on the scene and entered the reactor building at 10:45. Two of the men were found soaked in radioactive water, with Byron's dead and McKinley slowly moving and groaning from a head injury. Prioritising McKinley, the rescue team focused on trying to save the injured operator. But with only one entry at 1 minute per person, it would take until 10:50 before they could successfully place him on a stretcher and remove him from the structure. McKinley would not regain consciousness and would succumb to his wounds at 11 p.m. Although dead, his body was still deadly, measuring gamma radiation at 500 rotogens an hour, even after being stripped of his contaminated clothing. It would take until 11:38 p.m. for the discovery of the final victim, Richard Legg, whom had been impaled to the ceiling above their heads. After the discovery of all the victims, the rescue efforts slowed down as to protect the safety of the recovery team. The next night, Byron's body was recovered by a team of 6 volunteers. It wouldn't be until the 9th that an attempt could be made to recover Legg's body. The process to remove Legg's body would be practiced in the safety of the Dugway Proving Ground, as it would involve a 1.5 by 6.1 metre stretcher attached to a crane. This process would take 10 men, each working in intervals of 65 seconds, to pull Legg's body off the shield plug by using hooks on long poles. Eventually his body became free and fell onto the stretcher suspended from the crane. Originally it was thought that the disaster was caused by a chemical explosion, believing the reactor to be safe. However, a gold watch worn by one of the operators showed evidence that the buckle had reactive gold, and other items in the men's possession showed neutron-activated elements. The bodies had to be treated as if they were nuclear waste due to their potential for polluting the environment, and were buried in lead-lined coffins placed inside metal vaults, with some of the more radioactive parts being buried in the Idaho desert with other nuclear waste. The clean-up efforts would take 475 people 18 months. It was decided that to transport all the contaminated waste to the radioactive waste management complex 16 miles away would cause too much risk of radiation exposure, as the journey would travel over public roads. Instead, a burial site was established 500 metres from the reactor. The first main hurdle was cleaning up the contaminated reactor room of all dangerous materials. Once this was done, a 60-ton crane was employed to remove the reactor vessel from the building. As the reactor building was deconstructed, any contaminated materials got disposed of in the burial site. However, any parts of the structure and reactor core that would be needed in a later investigation were sent separately to the Aircraft Nuclear Program's Hotshot Inspection Centre, after which they were sent to the radioactive waste complex. In total, after completion of the clean-up efforts in September 1962, 2,800 metres of dangerous material was placed in the burial site, up to a depth of 4.3 metres, with half a metre of clean soil placed above. The site is now known as United States Environmental Protection Agency Operational Unit 5-05. The cause of the incident would be a mystery over the following 2 years of the investigation. They knew the reactor went critical, but they didn't know why the control rod was pulled out so far. Maintenance procedures stated that the rod would only be needed to be manually moved 10 centimetres. However, it was estimated that Byron's actually withdrew it 66 centimetres, causing the reactor to go critical, setting off the steam and water hammer that would destroy the vessel. Much of the damage to the building and the impaling of Legg was put down to the high pressure water jet initiated by the vaporised fuel. Using scratches on the control rods and analysing the newly installed flux wires, investigators managed to establish any movement under 58.4 centimetres of the rod would not have caused the reactor to go critical. However, it would have only taken Byron's 500 milliseconds to move the rod between 58.4 and the eventual 66 centimetres. Unfortunately, he had no time to correct his action. However, still a mystery was why the rod had been moved over the 10 centimetres needed in the first place. As there were no logs made during the process, some worrying theories were proposed. Here are the main theories from least to most likely. A suicide murder because of an affair with one of the other crew members' wives, plain old suicide, sabotage, accidental withdrawal, and finally an attempt to make the rod travel freely within the core by working it backwards and forwards. There is some weight, unfortunately, behind the murder-suicide theories, as Byron's and Legg were from the same training class, and Legg had surpassed him becoming a supervisor, and the 3rd of January was the first shift Legg had worked, being in charge of his old classmate. Also, on the day of the critical event, Byron's had been informed that his wife wanted a divorce. Whether an intentional mistake or not, it is not unthinkable to think that Byron's mind was not on the job at hand. The last theory is thought to be the most likely case, as the design of the SL1 had an unwanted side effect: sticky control rods. This meant that over the 3 years that the reactor was operational, 40 events of a stuck control rod had been reported, and the number had dramatically increased over the latter part of 1960, with 4 happening in the month leading up to the incident. It was thought that the reason for the problem of stuck control rods were caused by corrosion, clutch and drive bearing issues on the rotational assembly in the core, and a misalignment issue. The rod that went critical, number 9, was in the centre of the core. A bearing or clutch issue would be unlikely, as sticking only occurred during rotation. This would affect the other non-central control rods more. Even though the cause was highlighted, the rapid removal of control rod number 9, the reason for the movement will likely still remain a mystery. The aftermath of the SL1 incident caused the design to be abandoned, and for future reactors to not have the ability to go critical after the removal of just one control rod. Other low power reactors would be made during the Army Reactors Branches project. However, the outbreak of the Vietnam War would divert Army resources, stopping the program in 1965. During the cleanup, around 790 people were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. The area would be monitored for decades to come. 32 workers would receive commendation for heroism for their role during the recovery and cleanup operation. It is lucky that the reactor was situated in a relatively isolated area, and the building itself did well to contain a lot of contaminants. However, in 1995, the Environmental Protection Agency recommended a cap be built over the burial sites, as these were still hotspots of radiation. The cap was made out of local rocks and rubble and was completed in 2000. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do you have any suggestions for future videos? Let me know in the comments below. Help the channel grow by liking, sharing and subscribing. If you'd like to support the channel financially, I also have a Patreon and the link is in the description. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. History can be horrible, and the beginning part of the 20th century certainly had some horrific moments, and would not have been the best time to be around. You would think that one world war would be the unluckiest situation to find yourself in, especially for an 18 to 20-year-old, as it would be a terror that would define the rest of your life. And surely if you survived that, then Lady Luck would be on your side. Well, think unfortunately again, as one of the unluckiest generations had to fight in not one, but 2 of them. And the time in between was not too pleasant either. With the centenary of the end of World War I just passing as I write this script, I thought about my Irish great-granddad, who was born in 1899 and ended up serving in the British Army during the Great War. He would survive only to die in his early 30s of a chest infection. But it got me thinking, if he had lived to old age, he would have lived through one of the most unluckiest periods in history, in my opinion. Let's imagine you're one of my great-granddad's generation, born in 1899 to a working-class family in, say, London, England. Turn of the century London was not the most pleasant of places to live, especially if you were poor, where 1 in 5 children die before their first birthday, and a working-class person would earn about £1 a week. Also, if you survived the first year, you would have a 1 in 10 chance of not making it to adulthood. The survivors didn't have it much better, with some parts of London having 25 families sharing one toilet. But your long journey of bad luck is only at its start. Fast forward to 1914 and the outbreak of war in July. The great powers mobilise and you are just leaving school at the age of 15. Too young to join up yourself, but you see many people in your slums sign up and gradually leave for war. Now, I say you would be too young to sign up, as during the war the legal age to serve abroad was 19. However, many soldiers saw active duty as young as 15. This was due to recruitment officers turning a blind eye to clearly underage recruits. Let's assume you come across an officer that plays by the rules and you're forced to wait until 1917 before you can enlist. although in reality over 250,000 underage soldiers served in the British Army. After seeing out the closing years of the First World War and scarred with the sights, smells and sounds you would have encountered, you might be looking forward to returning home a hero. Well, possibly not, as between 1918 and 1919 a pandemic would hit the world, killing, depending on estimates, between 3 and 5% of the world's population. It would be known as the Spanish flu, and unlike other influenza outbreaks that mostly took aim at the weak and elderly, this time the victims would be young healthy adults. It would be the conditions of the soldiers' quarters during the end of the First World War that the flu would thrive in, and with millions of men demobilising and returning home, the deadly virus was spread quicker than any pandemic before it. The flu gained its name from the false impression of Spain seeing the highest mortality from the disease. It actually wasn't any better or worse than any other country, but the press in neutral Spain were allowed to report freely on the outbreak, whereas wartime censors for countries like France, Germany and the UK avoided reporting on the illness as to not affect their respective populations' morale. By December 1920, between 50 and 100 million people would be dead across the world. If you're lucky enough to survive so far and make it back home, life post-war was filled with apathy and disinterest in the experiences of ex-service personnel. With mental health conditions like PTSD going untreated, many men suffered in silence. During the war, many women filled the roles in many industries, and this led to a worker surplus in the post-war years. The surplus was further compounded by economic decline as wartime industries closed down, and national debt mounted up. Britain, however, was one of the better places to be in, with its programmes to retrain ex-servicemen in new skills. Many countries saw social and political upheaval, for example the Russian and Irish civil wars, and the toppling of the German and Ottoman empires. During the 1920s, you would see vast expansion and economic boom. It would be around this time that a war veteran such as yourself might get married and have children and start putting money into the bank and move out to one of London's new suburbs. The USA thrived in the 1920s, however you couldn't get a drink due to prohibition, and that would be a bit of a downer if you lived there. This period you could say were the golden years. However, towards the end of the decade, storm clouds started to appear over the horizon. On the 20th of September 1929, the London stock market crashed after Clarence was imprisoned for forgery and fraud. This would set off a chain of events in which weakened American investments in European markets. For several weeks, the Wall Street Stock Exchange would become unstable, with large amounts of stocks being sold gradually, intensifying during October. On Thursday, the 24th of October, the market lost 11% of its value, marking the Wall Street Stock Exchange crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. Vast employment would hit the Western world, and the UK was no exception. By 1930, the jobless had more than doubled from an estimated 1 to 2.5 million, causing political crisis. Higher taxes and reduced unemployment benefits were proposed by an ever-increasing unpopular Labour government under Prime Minister James Ramsay MacDonald. To try and help the most needy, the government started the unemployment benefit system. However, to qualify, you needed to meet a strict means test. The test would involve a government official inspecting all of your assets and finances to see if you had any hidden earnings and savings. For many, it would be a humiliating experience and would spark several protests in the streets of London. Britain would lose the gold standard in 1931, which in turn would gradually help the country to recovery during the later part of the 1930s, stimulating another building boom in the south. However, some countries did not recover as quickly, and this led to a rise of National Socialism in Germany. Seen as a cure for the years of political and social upheaval, the Nazi Party would promise less unemployment and improve Germany's international standing. The storm cloud for war would start to loom again, as the militaristic Germany built up its armies and readied for European dominance. In 1939, you are age 40, and yet again the world powers would mobilise for war. France, Britain, Australia and New Zealand on the 3rd of September 1939 declare war on Germany after several provocative land grabs and the invasion of Poland.
Fight!
Unfortunately for you, the National Service Armed Forces Act of 1939 is enacted on the 3rd for all men aged 18 to 41, meaning you could be called for war once again, and to add salt to the wound, if you had a son, he could also be called if he was old enough. Even if you weren't called up, life wouldn't be easy, as you'd have to dodge the bombs falling nightly on London and all over the UK. The National Service Act stated if you were married, you would be called up after any single man. But eventually you would be called, as by the end of 1939, around 1.5 million had been conscripted into the armed forces. 1945 finally rolls in, and you've seen out another bloody world war. If you'd served in the armed forces, home time might be a while coming, as in the UK demobilisation was done on your age and how long you'd served. Even though you would be in your mid-40s, you wouldn't be the oldest serving, as later amendments to the Conscription Act in 1942 enrolled men as old as 51. In all, it took around 18 months to demobilise some 4.3 million British service personnel. Once home time had finally arrived, you would encounter a Britain still under rationing and a London in partial ruin. If that wasn't enough, many returning personnel received divorce papers, with 60,000 applications being processed in 1947. It would take years for Europe to recover from the Second World War, and another dark cloud would hold itself over life, known as the Cold War. In your retiring years of the 1950s and 1960s, you would see the nuclear age and the legitimate fear of total atomic annihilation, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, do you think this is one of the most unluckiest generations, or would you be more unlucky to have been alive in another period in history? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know it's a little bit different from the normal Plainly Difficult episode. If you liked it, leave me a thumbs up, and if you want to stay up to date on Plainly Difficult videos, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. I've got Patreon if you'd like to support the channel financially, and all that's left to say is thank you for watching. Nuclear weapons come in all shapes and sizes and have been designed for all sorts of applications. From the Tsar Bomber to the Davy Crockett, scientists during the Cold War experimented with pretty much any concept they could think of, and Project Blue Peacock is no exception. During the 1950s, there was a real fear of another war breaking out in the European continent, with divided Germany becoming the tinderbox for tensions. Armies on both the east and the west squared off against each other under NATO and the Warsaw Pact respectively. After the frightening speed of the capture of Seoul during the Korean War and the rate in which the front lines changed during the early part of the war, military planners attempted to find a way to stem a potential Soviet invasion in Europe. During the latter part of the 1950s, British scientists thought of a novel and completely impractical invention that could be used by the Army of the Rhine in the event of a Soviet invasion. The weapon devised was atomic landmines, pretty much the ultimate in burning of bridges, as a detonation of such a mine would make the surrounding area completely useless. Development began in 1954 at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment in Fort Housted, just outside Sevenoaks, Kent. And this is what it looks like from the window of a Honda Civic. The RARDE took the already tried and tested free-falling blue Danube as a basis for an atomic landmine. Weighing in at over 7 tons and looking rather like a deadly grain silo, the mine would yield 10 kilotons of Soviet stopping might. Due to the size of the device, testing would have to take place in a flooded gravel pit just outside Sevenoaks, which is a really nice place to visit and has a visitor centre worth checking out too. The bomb would have 3 means of detonation, either an 8-day timer, remote control, or if it was tampered with. Due to the weapon being essentially left unattended in the event of war, as the Army of the Rhine retreated, anti-tamper devices were pretty much important. The casing for the device was pressurised and would feature tilt and pressure switches. Detonation would occur after 10 seconds if the casing lost pressure, if the mine was moved after arming, or if the weapon was flooded. Once the mine went off, it was expected to create a crater of 114 metres across if on the surface, or 195 metres if buried 10.6 metres below the ground. Not only would the explosion destroy an oncoming army and create a big hole in the ground that would hinder tanks and the like, but the radiation left behind would deny the area for quite a while. The engineers did however find a small hiccup with the design, and this is how the Blue Peacock became famous. Due to the number of switches and delicate equipment on board, the mine was susceptible to reliability issues in the cold, and these issues would be further compounded if buried in the cold earth of a European winter. A bizarre solution was offered, and it was chickens. Weapons designers love using animals as a beaked persuasion for some reason. This time, however, instead of being a guidance system, the birds would be used to heat the device. Just enough food would be supplied for the chickens inside the bomb's casing to allow them to survive the 8 days the device would be left on its own. The body heat of the birds would be enough for the sensitive electronics to survive. Unfortunately, the chickens wouldn't, as once the food ran out, they would pass away. And also, if the bomb went off, they would also die. The British government ordered 10 units in June 1957 for use in Germany, and would be shipped under the cover story of being a portable atomic generator for British soldiers. Because, well, the British were not going to tell the German government what they really were. Who needs enemies when you have allies like this? The Ministry of Defence did see the potential political fallout, as well as the actual fallout, to be an issue for the UK, and subsequently cancelled the order in February 1958. Looking at the context of the period, floating an idea like this wasn't all that crazy, as during the 1950s nukes were even considered to be used to stop hurricanes, and there were plans to nuke the moon as well, to show that nowhere was safe. Well, I'm glad that didn't happen. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like or even subscribe. If you have any suggestions for future videos, let me know in the comments below. And also, if you'd like to support the channel financially, I've got a Patreon. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. Ever since the invention of flight, many daring raids have taken place, from the Doolittle raid to Operation Black Buck. Today, however, we are looking at the daring and controversial Israeli 1981 raid on an Iraqi nuclear reactor. Our story starts on the 17th of August 1959 with Iraq's establishment of its nuclear program under an agreement with the USSR. By 1968, the USSR would provide a 2 megawatt nuclear reactor called the IRT 5000, and Iraq would sign the Nuclear Non Proliferation Treaty, ratifying it a year later. The treaty legitimised the Iraqi nuclear program, but would limit it to only being able to develop nuclear energy, removing any right to make an atomic weapons program. Throughout the 1970s, Iraq would seek to build upon its fledgling nuclear program, and would again ask in 1975 help from the USSR. Iraq throughout the 1960s and 70s had been seeking a clandestine nuclear and chemical weapons program. However, this time Moscow would only provide a new reactor if the station would be regulated by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iraq, unsurprisingly, refused the deal. This was because the fledgling atomic program would not be used for purely energy reasons, and having a nuclear reactor checked out by the IAEA would quickly thwart any nuclear weapon ambitions. Iraq would search for a new technological provider, and they would find this in France and Italy. After approaching Paris and failing to procure a gas-cooled graphite plutonium producing reactor and reprocessing plant, another deal was offered for an already established reactor type. The French were willing to sell 72 kilograms of uranium and a non-agency regulated reactor for $300 million. The reactor was an Osiris-class research unit. After a deal was signed in November 1975, construction began on a new reactor in 1979. The reactor project was announced internationally by the Iraqis and the French, but it was solely for the use of peaceful research. The procurement agreement of the facility had a clause that excluded military use of the Osiris reactor. The reactor was a 40 megawatt light water nuclear plant, though it could be scaled up to 70 megawatts. And it was sited at the Al Tuifa nuclear centre near Baghdad. The French would name it Osirak, a portmanteau of Osiris and Iraq. The Iraqis named the reactor Tammuz 1. The reactor building would be 100 metres long and 21 metres high. The site also held the Soviet-built reactor and a smaller French-built reactor. In July 1980, the first of 6 12.5 kilogram shipments of uranium from France arrived, and eventually the reactor could be capable of producing material for a nuclear weapons program. The Iraqi nuclear program did not go unnoticed, with Israel under the Yitzhak Rabin government and the newly established Islamic Republic of Iran watching as the atomic industrial work intensified, as it seemed suspicious that a country with no shortage of oil would be seeking out an alternative to fossil fuel. Israel would begin to actively plan to derail the nuclear program, leading up to the late 1970s. In 1977, on the 21st of June, Menachem Begin took over as Israeli Prime Minister, taking Iraq's anti-Zionist threats as a serious issue. The new government began to make preparations for a preemptive attack on Iraq, before the Iraqi nuclear weapons program could get off the ground. Whilst plans for sabotage were being made, Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan sought out a diplomatic resolution to stop the reactor, with France, Italy, and with help from the US. However, diplomatic efforts yielded no discernible result. France, in an attempt to make the reactor more palatable, inserted a clause in the agreement with Iraq that for at least 10 years that the reactor would be overseen by a French technician. However, this would not subdue the fear of an Iraqi reactor in the region. Parts of the reactor awaiting transport in Les Saint-Lémer in 1979 were sabotaged, and in 1980 Yahya El-Mashad, an Egyptian nuclear scientist leading the Iraqi program, was found dead under suspicious circumstances in his hotel room at Le Méridien in Paris. Also, a number of French and Italian contractor companies were bombed and others were threatened. The incidents were thought to be linked to Mossad agents. These clandestine operations only slowed the reactor down, so a more substantial plan was needed. A planned raid would have to take place 990 miles away from Etzion, Israel's closest airbase, and the potential flight path would violate both Saudi and Jordanian airspaces. And once reaching Iraqi territory, the aircraft would have to fly below radar cover at an altitude of just 100 feet. To be able to sneak past Jordanian and Saudi defences, the flight would make radio contact only in Arabic and would use only Saudi or Jordanian formations and signals. This meant that in-flight refuelling was out of the question. The military planners would opt to use heavily fuelled and armed aircraft. However, the operational limitations were not the only hurdle to a surgical strike on the Azirat site. The decision to pull the trigger on a preemptive strike was a controversial one, and because of this, the subject was a hot topic of the Begin government. There was a legitimate fear that a strike could hinder the fragile Egyptian-Israel peace talks, create anxiety in Arab countries in the area, damage Israel's profile as a regional power, break down French-Israeli relations, as well as hinder Israel in the future on the international stage. Foreign Minister Dayan, Defence Minister Etzel Weizmann, and Deputy Prime Minister Yair Yadin opposed the strike. Even Yashia Sage, head of military intelligence, advised the continuation of non-military efforts to stop the Iraqi nuclear program. This was because of the time estimated for the program to create material for an atomic weapon was between 5 and 10 years. However, Begin and others in his cabinet, including future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, thought the political ramifications would be minimal, and spurred on by the worst case scenario of weapons material being available in 2 years, pushed for the airstrike to take place. Also, it's thought that the strike, before the reactor became operational, would reduce the potential environmental impact, and being so close to Baghdad, could in theory expose a large population to radiation. Whilst Israel decided whether to or not to launch an attack, the Islamic Republic of Iran beat them to the punch and launched an airstrike of their own on the 30th of September 1980. The attack made sense as Iran and Iraq were in the opening days of a war that would last the best part of 8 bloody years. The attack did not fully destroy the reactor plant and only damaged control rooms and cooling systems, both of which were relatively easy to repair and quickly bring the reactor back on track to becoming operational. With information from a US satellite, Mossad agents, and the failed Iranian September attack, an operational date of June 1981 was predicted by Israel. And in October, a vote in the Israeli cabinet was held to determine whether a strike would go ahead. A vote of 6 to 10 in favour for the strike was cast, and Operation Opera would get the green light. Even though Iran and Israel were publicly enemies, behind the scenes clandestine cooperation was upheld from the pre-revolutionary Iranian government days. Allegedly, the Israeli Air Force received reconnaissance photos from the Iranian Air Force in a follow-up flight over Azirat in November 1980. The Israeli Air Force had found a black spot in the Iraqi radar cover on the border with Saudi Arabia. This chink in the armour was known to the Iraqi armed forces, but had not fought to fix it, as there was never an expectation for an attack from Saudi Arabia. Operation Opera would use 8 new US-built F-16As, each with 2 Mark 84 2,000 pound or 925 kilogram delay fuse bombs. To accompany the attack, 6 F-15As, also newish and US built, were provided for fighter support. During the practice efforts leading up to the strike, pilots had been trained on A4 Skyhawks, but later changed to the newer aircraft as deliveries of F-16As were diverted from revolutionary anti-US Iran to Israel. Highly skilled pilots were picked for the attack, including Israel's first astronaut, Ilan Ramon. The operation would benefit from the Iran-Iraq war, where the key H3 airfield was struck in April 1981 by the Iranians, destroying many Iraqi airplanes, greatly diminishing their retaliational potential. The operation started on the 7th of June 1981. The date was picked as being a Sunday. There would be a lower likelihood of workers on site, including any foreign contractors. However, on the day this was not the case. Just before 4 PM local time, 1 PM GMT, the heavily fuelled and armed flight took off heading for Iraq. Unknowingly, the squadron flew past King Hussein of Jordan, who was holidaying on his yacht in the Gulf of Aqaba. Noticing that the planes were not Jordanian, Hussein tried to raise the alarm, but unfortunately for the Iraqis, the message didn't make it through. Upon reaching the Iraqi border, the flight split up, with 2 F-15s staying with the F-16s, and the remaining F-15s split off in different directions to try and confuse the Iraqi defences. The formation heading for the reactor dropped to 100 feet to try and fly under radar cover. By 6:35 PM local time, 14:35 GMT, the attack formation had reached 12 miles from the reactor. At this point, the aircraft shot up 6,900 feet to avoid the earthworks built around the reactor site and turned into a 35-degree dive, hitting just under 700 miles per hour. At 3,600 feet, the F-16s started releasing their bombs in pairs every 5 seconds. Out of a total of 16 bombs, 8 hit the dome of the reactor building. After just 2 minutes, the attack was over and the aircraft turned and headed back to Israel, evading anti-aircraft fire. 10 Iraqi soldiers, 1 French worker, and a destroyed reactor lay in the wake of the strike, with no Israeli casualties. 2 days after the attack, Begin set up a press conference taking responsibility for the attack, saying pretty dramatically, "We chose this moment now, not later, because later may be too late, perhaps forever." As if we stood by idly 2-3 years, at the most 4 years, and Saddam Hussein would have produced his 3, 4, 5 bombs. Then this country and this people would have been lost after the Holocaust. Another Holocaust would have happened in the history of the Jewish people. Never again, never again. Tell your friends, tell anyone you meet, we shall defend our people with all the means at our disposal. We shall not allow any enemy to develop weapons of mass destruction turned against us. The attack didn't go unnoticed internationally, and Israel was to see a different kind of fallout that would have been expected if Iraq was operational. The United Nations condemned the attack, stating it was a clear violation of the Charter of the United Nations and the norms of international conduct. Even the traditional friends of Israel were shocked at the unprovoked attack on a sovereign state. The US newspapers called it state-sponsored terrorism and inexcusable. The International Atomic Agency condemned the attack on the 12th of June, stating the agreement between France and Iraq excluded military use and inspections of the reactors at the site had no compliance or safety breaches. On the 19th of June, the UN announced Resolution 487, calling for a cease of hostile activities, gave Iraq the right to claim for compensation, and urged Israel to place its own nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards. The resolution passed with a vote of 15-0. Unsurprisingly, some of the Arab states were particularly damning of not only Israel, but also the US for supplying the weapons carried out in the attack. In response, the US froze the delivery of a number of aircraft destined for Israel, but blocked any further punishment. Several months later, however, the order was unfrozen and the aircraft were eventually delivered. Iraq, unsurprisingly, wasn't happy about the attack, claiming it was a diversion from Israel's own nuclear program and demanded compensation for damage and loss of life. The Iraqi government would still be demanding payment for the next 30 years. Internally, Saddam Hussein ordered the execution of Colonel Fawzi Hussein Jabir, head of the Western Air Defense for failing to stop the attack. A number of other officers would also be executed and several pilots would be imprisoned. The reactor was planned to be rebuilt again by the French, but issues with payment put the project on hold indefinitely. Saddam, over the following decade, built up Iraq's army and sought out other weapon types with its chemical and biological programs. With France out of the picture, the Iraqi nuclear program stalled, and by 1991 and the end of the Gulf War, only a few grams of weapons-grade uranium had been produced. The one French national killed in the attack, 25-year-old engineer Damien Chassepid, had restitution paid to his family from the Israeli government. The attack also shaped the 1981 Israeli legislative election, bolstering waning support for the Begin government. Bizarrely, not for the attack itself, but for the disgust of the leader of the opposition's criticism of the attack. The strike would be used to form the Begin doctrine adopted by future Israeli governments for preventative strikes against potential enemies. The doctrine would be used in 2007 on an attack on a Syrian nuclear site, although this time international outcry was minimal. The attack on the Focusrite Reactor site in June 1981 will be remembered as a daring and interesting slice of history, albeit at the time a controversial one. Although international outcry was pretty deafening at the time, the opinion on the raid would soften, especially after the First Gulf War, where Iraq had no ability to deploy nuclear weapons. Although it is unsure whether Operation Opera disallowed Iraqi nuclear weapons, as a program for enough weapons-grade materials would never have fulfilled the quota for any atomic threat. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me a thumbs up. Do you have any suggestions for future videos? If you do, let me know in the comments. I've got a Patreon if you fancy supporting the channel financially, and all that's left to say is thank you for watching. Battles are usually big, messy affairs, often leading to stalemates. Needless to say, this can lead to long, drawn-out conflicts, draining any nation involved of materials and personnel. However, in 1351, a pretty novel idea of settling a dispute was enacted, and would be seen at the time as the ultimate act of noble chivalry. It would be known as the Combat of the 30. The arranged battle was part of the Breton War for Succession. With a name like the Combat of the 30, unsurprisingly, it would involve 30 combatants. However, it would mean 30 champions, knights and squires on each side, so really it's the Combat of the 60. With the backing from the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England respectively, the result from the combat could have potentially had wider political implications in the region. Between 1351 and 1364, the succession of the Duchy of Brittany was fought out between two rival factions. The French King Philip VI-backed House of Blois and the English King Edward III-backed House of Montfort. 15 years since the beginning of the 100 Years' War, the contest for Brittany had become a bit of a stalemate, with the Blois faction under Jean de Beaumanoir and the Montfort side under John de Montfort. Both sides would carry out raids into each other's territory, controlled by numerous castles, but no land changed hands for long. In early 1351, Robert Bramborough of the English-backed House of Montfort, in charge of the stronghold at Ploermel, was challenged to a single combat by Blois stronghold of Jocelyn, Commander Jean de Beaumanoir. In response, Bramborough offered not a single fight, but instead to raise 30 of their best men on each side to fight it out to see who was the victor. Enthusiastically, Beaumanoir accepted the reply, and the two factions prepared for combat. Now, the reasons for the challenge are a bit unknown. However, slightly biased Blois ballad depicts Bramborough as the ruthless despoiler of the local population, and the scared locals go to Beaumanoir for help. Beaumanoir is depicted as a hero coming to the aid of the defenceless people. However, it is possibly unlikely, as both sides pretty much raided where they liked. Another theory, that it was purely a matter of honour of chivalry, or maybe they were just bored and wanted a fight. The combat was set up in a similar way to a tournament, with refreshments and gathering of spectators. The battleground was agreed by both parties at around the halfway point between Ploermel and Jocelyn. The Franco-Brenton side of 30 consisted of 10 knights including de Beaumanoir and 20 squires, all native Bretons. The Anglo-Breton side had 7 knights including Sir Robert Bremborough and 23 squires and men-at-arms. The force was mixed, consisting of only 20 Englishmen and the remaining men being 6 German mercenaries and 4 Breton partisans. The French had the benefit of their fighters having a proven combat pedigree, whereas the English side was a little bit more ragtag. The two parties faced off against each other on the 26th of March 1351, armed with daggers, swords, spears and axes on foot. The combat was fierce and, according to contemporary reports, fought with gallantry on both sides. After several hours, a break for refreshments was called, at which point 4 French and 2 English lay dead on the battlefield. The time allowed both sides to bandage wounds and prepare for another bout of combat. After the combat resumed, the English-Breton side took a severe blow, with Bremborough being slain. The English side formed a tight defensive formation, repelling several French attacks. The day would be decided by Squire Guillaume de Montauban mounting a horse and breaking the English line, forcing a surrender. This action was against the rules, but by this point the damage was done. By the end of the combat, everyone was either wounded or dead, with 9 slain on the English side and 6 French laying dead on the field. In the spirit of chivalry, the English combatants were captured, treated well, and released after a small ransom was paid. In the grand scheme of things, the combat of the 30 changed pretty much nothing and would have most likely gone down in history as a footnote, albeit an interesting one, and be forgotten about. However, the story captured the imagination of contemporary society as an act of the highest form of honour and chivalry. Chronicler Jean Froissart wrote that the warriors held themselves as valiantly on both sides as if they had all been Rolands and Olivers. The event was honoured in poems and chronicles, and even had a commemorative stone placed at the combat site, and King Charles V of France commissioned a tapestry. Some of the 30 became local celebrities, being honoured by the French king. As the years went by, the narrative changed for the combat portraying the English as the aggressors and being there to terrorise the poor people. On the English side, the combat wasn't seen as much of an honourable win by the French, mainly due to Montauban mounting a horse against the rules. The loss was seen as evidence of a treacherous and cheating opponent. As with many historical events, this spin possibly appeared as a form of propaganda. The combat of 30, albeit meaningless in the grand scheme of the war that it represented, shows an interesting way to settle differences. The Breton War of Succession would ultimately be won by the English-backed House of Montfort after the Battle of Auray in 1364. It is certain that many wars could have been a hell of a lot less bloody if nations decided to sort things out via a tournament rather than, the whole destructive massive war thing. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do you have any interesting subjects you'd like me to cover? Let me know in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, and if you'd like to support the channel financially, I have a Patreon, and all the links is in the description below. All that's left to say is thank you for watching. When I think of nuclear reactor incidents during the Cold War, normally Russia, the US and the UK jump to mind. However, one of the first ever nuclear reactor incidents to happen in the world was in Canada. Luckily though, in this story no one was killed in a horrific way by a rogue part of the reactor. The unlikely venue for a potential catastrophic incident might be surprising. However, the research reactor in Canada was for a time the world's most powerful research facility. Even more bizarrely, the aftermath of the partial meltdown would be cleaned up by a team of individuals, including a future President of the United States of America. Like most early nuclear endeavours of the Cold War, our story begins during the Second World War. Canada found itself the ideal place for atomic research, being mostly out of the reach of the Axis forces. A collaborative arrangement between Canada and the UK in 1942 arose under the Montreal Laboratory of Canada's National Research Council. The NRC used scientists from Canada, Britain and a number of European countries displaced from the Nazi occupation of mainland Europe. The main goal was to develop a heavy water reactor research facility. Later on into the project, the USA also got involved. A town called Chalk River, 110 miles northwest of Ottawa, was selected for the site for the nuclear research facility. The area was ideal for a nuclear reactor, being next to the Ottawa River, which would become a healthy source of cooling water. In 1945, the world's first non-USA based nuclear reactor, known as the ZEEP, or Zero Energy Experimental Pile, went online, marking Chalk River as one of the world's centres for atomic development. The new reactor would be used as a leading experimental tool for developing heavy water based systems, and would pave the way for the reactor that the title of this video is about, the NRX. The National Research Experimental Reactor, abbreviated to NRX, was the direct successor to the ZEEP, and was heavy water moderated and light water cooled, capable of creating 10 megawatts of power when it first went operational in 1947. Firstly, the heavy water slows down the resulting neutrons from fission, creating a greater likelihood of more fission reactions. The second form of governing the reactor came from the control rods, which are used to absorb neutrons without themselves fissioning. The removal of water or the inserting of the rods can stop fission, reducing the power output or shutting down the reactor completely. The reactor consisted of an aluminium calandra, basically a big cylindrical tank of water 8 meters wide by 3 meters high. Inside the calandra housed the core, consisting of 175 6 centimeter diameter vertical tubes arranged in a hexagonal lattice. Located inside most of the tubes were the fuel elements surrounded by air. Surrounding the tubes and inside the calandra was up to 14,000 litres of heavy water, topped off with helium gas to prevent corrosion of the reactor core's components. The whole reactor was surrounded by thick concrete walls and topped off by a rotating deck, and below the calandra was a sump designed to catch any heavy water leak. 3 heavy water storage tanks were located below the reactor and were 4.7mm thick, made of stainless steel, and were mainly empty. Even though the NRX represented the apex of reactor design, a replacement was even in the works as early as 1947. The fuel inside the NRX was formed into 3.1 metre long, 31mm diameter rods, consisting of an outer sheath, a cooling water annulus, and an inner sheath weighing a hefty 55 kilograms per element. The outer sheath was surrounded by the air inside the tube, located at the reactor core, and had a flow of around 8 kilograms a second. The cooling water inside the annulus came from the Ottawa River at a flow rate of up to 250 litres of water per second. The fuel rods extended both above and below the calandra, as can be seen in this 1961 report into the design of the NRX. To control the reactor, 12 of the vertical tubes were employed as control rods, made of boron carbide powder inside steel container tubes. The rods were held in place by powerful electromagnets above the reactor. This design feature was ingenious, as in the event of a power failure and a de-energization of the magnets would cause the rods to fall with the help of gravity into the reactor core, shutting down any further chain reactions. To remove the control rods, a set schedule had to be used in order to maintain control of the reactor, and to reduce the risk of any unforeseen flux. If the prescribed sequence was not adhered to, a safety circuit would trip, releasing the control rods, shutting down the reactor. The design of the control rod system was intended to shut down the reactor within seconds. However, to achieve this time expectation, the rods were attached to a pneumatic system. The air pressure could be used to slowly raise the control rods from the reactor as well. 7 of the 12 rods would absorb enough neutrons to shut down the reactor completely. However, 4 were used as a safety bank for any planned shutdowns. The remaining 8 rods went up and down using the preset sequence. The 2 banks of rods were activated by push buttons on the main panel in the control room. Another push button to seal the rods to the pneumatic system was located on the same panel. However, a few paces away on a separate control panel contained a button to blow down the rods into the reactor in the event of an emergency. Red lights in the control room were used to indicate to the operators whether the control rods were inside the reactor or not. However, this system would prove to have a potentially deadly fault, but we'll come back to this in a bit. On the 12th of December 1952, one of the world's first nuclear incidents would begin to unfold. The NRX was operating at low power whilst the calandra tubes were being investigated for a cooling issue. For the tests, some of the tubes were disconnected from the original water cooling system and instead were connected to a temporary arrangement with hoses. One of the tubes, however, were only being cooled by air. During tests, a supervisor noticed something very worrying happening to the reactor's control rods. You see, below the calandria were several valves in charge of controlling the rod's pneumatic system. By accident, an operator in the basement turned 4 valves, causing the air pressure from above holding the rods inside the reactor to be released, and the air pressure from below caused 4 rods to rise out of the core. The unwanted movement set off red lights in the main control room. Alarmed by this indication, the reactor supervisor phoned down to the operator in the basement to immediately stop what he was doing. Once off the phone, the supervisor hurriedly made his way down to the basement and closed the valves himself. After checking the air pressure, the supervisor assumed the control rods had made their way back into the core. Rightly so, as the red lights in the control room had now been extinguished. However, for an unknown reason, this indication was not correct. The supervisor from the basement called his assistant in the control room to request him to operate the push buttons to seal the withdrawn rods to the pneumatic system. During the phone call, a miscommunication led the assistant to push the draw safety bank button. In so doing, he placed the phone on the desk. Immediately realising the mistake instruction, the supervisor shouted down the phone to the assistant to stop what he was doing. However, due to the phone being on the desk, no such instruction was heard. At 15:07, the reactor started to double in power every 2 seconds, originally starting at 0.1 megawatts. An operator noticing the rate of power increase tripped the reactor after 20 seconds, which should have forced the safety bank of rods into the core. However, this didn't happen, and 90 seconds had passed, 3 rods had not moved, and the 4th had moved slowly into position. At this time, the reactor passed 17 megawatt. The water in the tubes attached to the temporary cooling system began to boil, eventually causing some of them to rupture, setting off power even higher. Around 14 seconds later, the valves of the calandria's heavy water were set off, dumping the heavy water onto the reactor building floor. The peak power reached an astonishing 80 megawatts before all the water moderator left the calandria. Without the heavy water, no more reactions could take place, and the power output fell to 0 after 25 seconds. In all, the reactor had been above 1 megawatt for just over 1 minute. Disaster averted? Actually, no, as a few of the fuel elements had melted, creating holes in the calandria, causing helium gas to escape. The melting fuel also released hydrogen and other gases as it reacted with the coolant water. Minutes later, at 15:11, the highly dangerous cocktail exploded. During the event, fission products in gas form were vented to atmosphere, and many litres of heavy water and contaminated coolant had leaked onto the reactor building floor. The incident was finally over. For several days after, the cooling system was kept running to remove any heat left over. However, this caused over 4,000 metres cubed of contaminated water to be dumped into the building's basement, reaching a depth of 1 metre. Needless to say, this would be a clean-up nightmare. During the clean-up efforts, the reactor core and calandria were removed and buried due to being damaged beyond repair. However, around 150 tubes had remained stable during the partial meltdown, showing that the design had proved to be fairly stable. The work inside the NRX reactor building took months to be fully decontaminated. The efforts drafted in 150 US Navy personnel, one of whom you might know as he was called Jimmy Carter, the future 39th President of the USA. A further 170 military, Canadian personnel and 20 civilian personnel were used to clean up the site, in addition to the 867 strong staff already working at Chalk River. Amazingly, the NRX would see many more years of use, albeit with a new core and calandria, finally being shut down on the 30th of March 1993 after 45 years of use. The legacy of the incident would be twofold, one good, one not so good. Let's start with the bad. With so much contaminated water created by the partial meltdown, a pipe was run to a sandy area some distance from the site complex. Around 10,000 curies of material was pumped into this area to seep away. This decision meant that the Ottawa River was saved from any major contamination. Water was monitored downriver for any sign of radioactive contamination, but luckily nothing above natural levels were found. Staff involved in the accident cleanup were monitored for any health conditions, and again thankfully nothing was reported above natural expected levels. So compared to some other incidents I've covered, the NRX is mild in terms of human and environmental casualties. Even though the legacy was not very bloody, the NRX partial meltdown is important for atomic history, as many lessons would be learnt from the event. Even though the root cause for the events on the 12th of December 1952 was operator error, ultimately the human-machine interface was the aggravating factor for the accident. as in a report by W.B. Lewis, who suggested a revised operational procedure should be adapted to take into account operator error. Future reactors will be designed with assurances for complete reactor shutdown via independence and variation of safety systems. So I suppose you could say that would be one of the good legacies of the incident. As we already know, the NRX continued to operate after substantial repairs, and its successor, known as the NRU, will carry on the evolution of reactor design and practices after its operational date of the 3rd of November 1957. However, it too would suffer an incident in 1958. Well, I suppose mistakes are made on the way to perfection. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me a like, and if you'd like to, you can always subscribe. If you have any suggestions for future videos, let me know in the comments below, and I have a Patreon if you fancy supporting me financially. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. As you may or may not know, I'm a Londoner, more to the point a South Londoner. And as a young plainly, I always wondered why people would call this plot of empty land Croydon Airport, even though there was and still is a lack of planes. Well, this is partly due to today's subject, the tragic 1924 de Havilland air crash. And this event would not only influence the direction of London's air transport, but also be an important milestone in the history of investigations into commercial air disasters. In the early 1920s, Croydon Airport, just on the southern outskirts of Greater London, was the de facto main airport for the UK's capital. Originally constructed as two separate airports, the Beddington Aerodrome and the Whaddon Aerodrome during the First World War. Many of these small airstrips popped up to defend against the threat of Zeppelin attacks on the capital. In 1920, the two runways were merged to form the Croydon Aerodrome and was tasked with handling all international flights to and from London. During this time, Plough Lane, a main road that divided the airport, remained open to traffic and would be intermittently closed for arriving and departing flights. I should probably say that even though this was London's international airport, only a few scheduled flights would take place each day, nowhere near the scale of Gatwick or London Heathrow today. Early destinations were Rotterdam, Paris, and Amsterdam. However, Berlin Tempelhof was added in 1923 for the Paris peace talk. Come 1924, and the Croydon Aerodrome was the first airport in the world to have a new safety feature, an air traffic control tower. The growth of the burgeoning new airport created the UK's first national airline, called Imperial Airways, founded in March 1924 with a fleet of around 22 aircraft. The backbone of the Imperial Airways fleet was the de Havilland DH-34, a single-engine biplane capable of carrying 10 passengers and 2 crew, consisting of a plywood fuselage, wooden wings, and a 12-cylinder engine outputting 450 horsepower. Needless to say, such an aircraft would not be considered as safe by today's standards. On the 24th of December 1924, the Noon Express de Havilland DH-34 GEBBX was getting ready for a scheduled flight between Croydon and France, with 8 souls on board. The 2-year-old airplane had been in service with another operator since March 1922, and in April 1924, the aircraft had received a new non-standard set of wings. After a collision in May of the same year, the plane received another new set of wings, albeit this time of standard configuration, receiving a new certificate of airworthiness on the 24th of November. Just 1 month before its ill-fated last flight. Moments after takeoff, the aircraft was seen flying low over the town of Purley, circling and zigzagging before entering a nosedive and crashing into the ground with a large explosion. Within 10 minutes, according to the Yorkshire Evening Post, leaving nothing but distorted metal parts of the aircraft. Hardly surprising, due to the flammable material of the aircraft's wings and fuselage. No one survived the crash, with one eyewitness to the wreckage site saying, "I ran to the spot, but by the time I got there, the whole machine was burnt away. I could see in the wreckage charred remains of bodies. All of the passengers must have died instantaneously. Their clothes were gone and their bodies were black. None of the bodies could be recovered from the wreckage until the fire brigade managed to get the inferno under control. All passengers and crew were lost in the crash. The accident was Imperial Airways' first fatal accident. Not a good start for the newly formed company. An insurance claim was approved for the loss of the aircraft from the British Aviation Insurance Group. Now, aviation of this period was hardly the safest endeavour, and a fatal crash, albeit tragic, wasn't the first accident linked to Croydon or even linked to this particular type of aircraft. With no immediate obvious cause for the crash, an inquiry was launched on the 29th of December in Croydon town. The initial parts of the investigation heard the basic facts, for example the pathologist reports, evidence of identification and witness reports. The inquest was adjourned until the 9th of January 1925. Upon returning, the investigation heard evidence that the plane had, in the days leading up to the accident, suffered with engine troubles due to low oil pressure. Engine issues would be backed up by witness reports of the aeroplane's long and slow takeoff from the airstrip, taking 700 yards to finally get off the ground, and even then slowly increasing altitude before eventually crashing. Witnesses near the crash site in Purley, 1.5 miles away from Croydon, stated that the aircraft's engine was making a rattling noise. However, both these reports were contradicted by Imperial Airways' own witnesses, who claimed engine noise was normal and every departure of the day took off long and slow due to the rain-soaked grass runway. The plane had been running uphill as well, which would have also slowed down the gain in altitude. The inquest was adjourned again to be reopened on the 14th of January. At the reopening of the inquest, a public inquiry was announced. It would be the first of such an inquiry for an air crash in British history. In lead up to the public inquiry, the inquest in Croydon heard more evidence of the loading weight of the plane and the condition of the runway. During this time, an accusation was thrown at Imperial Airways regarding interference with a witness. However, this was quickly shot down by the coroner. Interestingly, the plane was near full capacity at 710 kilograms, of an allowed 713. The inquiry was adjourned again until the 21st of January, only to be adjourned again in light of new evidence and Imperial Airways General Manager Major Wood Humphreys being taken ill. This would hold up the inquiry until February the 12th. In the meantime, a public inquiry at the Strand's Royal Courts of Justice in London had started its hearing on the 23rd of January. Headed by Sir Arthur Colfax and with Professor B.M. Jones and James Swinburne assessing. Originally, I had written a detailed day-to-day rundown of the public inquest. However, it did make the video a bit long and boring, and on many of the days the same points were brought up and argued. So I'll do a brief rundown of each day. The first day focused on evidence based around pilot David Stewart. His career started in 1917 during the First World War, earning in his military career the Military Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Force Cross. Unarguably, it would seem that the pilot in charge of the plane was very well experienced for any type of situation that would have come across him. It was also discovered that a petrol pipe in the wreckage had a limited flow of fuel. However, it was unknown whether the damage was pre or post crash. On the second day of the inquiry on the 25th of January, saw Major Cooper, who was in charge of investigating the crash for the investigation branch, gave evidence based on over 100 witness testimonies, seeming to suggest that the pilot had encountered engine troubles and was attempting to return to Croydon Airport. The plane had been away from Croydon for 6 days before the crash, and reports had been put in claiming that the engine had been running rough. Upon returning to Croydon, the engine oil was drained and refilled, and the engine was ran on the ground for 20 minutes. Cooper suggested that the engine should have been tested more rigorously, and he also condemned the fact that the fuel pipe used on the plane was not fit for military use. The inquiry was adjourned for a few more days, whilst charts of the aircraft's previous flights were analysed by experts. On the third day of the inquest, the analysed charts showed that the engine had no issues on the 2 flights leading up to the crash. However, on a previous flight to Amsterdam, a pilot did report that the engine had fluctuating oil levels. Nothing was done at the time of report due to the plane being due to return back to Croydon within an hour. Throughout the return flight, the oil pressure fluctuated and the plane was turned back to Amsterdam. However, this was due to poor weather conditions. Whilst at Amsterdam, a mechanic had a look at the plane. The mechanic was called to give evidence and stated that he replaced all 24 spark plugs and tests ran the engine for half an hour. On the return journey back to Croydon, the engine oil held pressure but still fluctuated. The Croydon-based mechanic also gave evidence similar to the Croydon inquiry that he had changed the oil and had ground tested the engine, yielding satisfactory results. The following day resumed the inquest, and the Inspector of Engines at Imperial Airways stated that the engine was in a service-ready condition. During the day, Imperial Airways' maintenance schedule was brought into question by a Mr. Bafus, a representative for one of the crash victims. However, a representative from the company's insurance, who had paid out on the claim for the plane crash, said that they had no issues with the way that the plane was maintained. On the 5th day, the director of Imperial Airways, Frank Surley, gave evidence to the inquiry, claiming that any pilot working for the company could refuse to fly any aircraft if they felt it was unsafe. Furthermore, the day saw more evidence on the aircraft's fuel pipes, and that armoured and unarmoured variants were in use and that both were approved by the Air Ministry. A representative of D. Napier & Son, an engineering company, backed up the claim of Imperial Airways that their mechanical maintenance schedule was of the highest quality. For the 6th day, the representative of the crash victims brought into question again the maintenance schedule of the plane. Not only Imperial came under attack, but this time the airport itself was under scrutiny for suitability for use with airliners. The inquiry was adjourned until the 2nd of February. Once the inquiry resumed, Croydon Airport announced that the site would be extended and the road dividing the runway would be diverted to allow for extra space. The announcement included that an Act of Parliament would be drafted for financing and would be secured, as it was thought that Croydon was the ideal place for a London airport. The inquiry was adjourned for one final time. On the final day, Mr. Bafus's accusations were rejected, and it was found that the Air Ministry had worked within its remit with Imperial Airways. Sir Arthur Colfax announced that he would visit with his assistants to Croydon Airport before the public report would be published. The 10th of February saw the publishing of the report into the accident. It was found that the aircraft was airworthy and that conditions of the runway on the day were a contributory factor. Both the Air Ministry, Imperial Airways and pilot David Stewart were cleared of all blame. The cause of the accident was an unknown mechanical failure, leading to a stall on an attempted emergency landing. The damage to the petrol pipe that was under scrutiny was agreed to have been caused post-crash during the rescue efforts. The local inquest, which had been adjourned during the public inquiry, resumed on the 12th of February. The coroner found that the public inquiry had shown that no one was at fault, and a verdict of misadventure was agreed by the jury. Essentially, the result was a bit of an anticlimax, as no one was to blame. However, the accident would set a precedent for in-depth investigations into further civil aviation accidents in the UK. Croydon Airport would continue to grow over the following decades, seeing use during the Second World War and some civil use post-war. The growth of the airport would be part of its undoing, as it encroached on local housing, leaving little room for expansion for newer, larger aircraft of the post-war era. The airport in its career saw 8 crashes, many of which were fatal. This, coupled with the lack of space, made other airstrips such as Heathrow a more commercially attractive option. The last plane to depart from Croydon took off in 1959, leaving a large undeveloped space behind. Today the airport is an industrial estate and some playing fields. However, one of the original buildings remain, known as Airport House. The world's oldest control tower still remains at the site, and many local roads are named after aviators and aircraft. Did you enjoy the video? I hope you did. If you did, leave a like. And if you'd like to see more videos on air crashes, let me know in the comments. If you like the channel and you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing for all the latest videos. If you fancy it, you can also support the channel financially through Patreon. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. Planes have been the target of hijackings and terrorist organisations ever since the first recorded incident in 1931. This is probably due to the amount of media coverage that any attempt would get, thus boosting any terrorist organisation's public profile. Believe it or not, there was actually a so-called golden age of hijacking where security in airlines left a lot to be desired. And because of this, between 1969 and 1980, many planes around the world would be targeted, from the notorious case of D.B. Cooker to the youngest ever hijacker, 14-year-old David Booth. Today's video is about a hijacking right in the middle of this deadly decade, the attack on Sabena Flight 571. but it would be the daring rescue mission which would cement this event in history. Sabena, short for Belgian Corporation for Air Navigation Services, was in 1972 Belgium's national airline. Flight 571, captained by Reginald Levy, DFC, prepared his Boeing 707 to depart from a scheduled stop in Vienna on a Brussels to Lod service on the 8th of May 1972. It would be the captain's 50th birthday, and because of this, his wife Dora was also aboard, as the two had planned to celebrate in Tel Aviv. All had been well during the first leg of the journey. However, once the plane reached 33,000 feet, just 20 minutes after departing Vienna, this run-of-the-mill journey would take a dangerous turn. Two men and two women who had been pretending to be couples, Ali Tahar Abu Sinna, Abed Al-Aziz Atrash, Rima Tanios and Teresa Hausa, leapt out of their seats brandishing two handguns, two grenades and two belts of explosives, quickly taking over control of the aircraft, with the two men forcing their way into the cockpit. The hijackers were members of the Black September organisation, a breakaway group of the PLO, an organisation with the purpose of the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle mainly aimed against Israeli and Jewish civilians. The group would be later on behind the tragic Munich Olympic hostage massacre. Captain Levy kept calm at gunpoint, announcing to the passengers over the PA, "As you can see, we have friends on board." Levy was ordered to stay on course to Lod. He would comply, albeit at the slowest possible speed, in order to give any chance of a rescue effort time to materialise. After the control had been taken of the aircraft, the hijackers went on to separate the passengers, forcing every Jewish hostage to the back of the plane. Both Levy and his first officer managed to transmit coded messages explaining the situation. As well as communicating to the ground, Captain Levy managed to get a message to the cabin crew asking to keep the identity of his wife secret. The coded messages would find their way to Moshe Dayan, setting off plans for rescue once the plane landed at Lod. Nighttime had reached Lod Airport as 571 landed. Quickly, the aircraft was shepherded to a quiet part of the airport. The hijackers made their demands known to release 315 Palestinian terrorist prisoners held in Israel. Otherwise, they would blow up the plane. Whilst the plane sat on the tarmac, Israeli agents managed to let out the air out to the aircraft's tyres and disabled the hydraulic system, immobilising 571. Levy managed to calm down the agitated hijackers by claiming that the plane had experienced technical issues, disallowing them from taking off again. Throughout the night, Levy spoke with the hijackers, saying later, "I talked about everything under the sun, from navigation to sex." His efforts helped build up the trust, buying everyone on board time for a rescue effort. On the morning of the 9th, Levy was sent to the terminal building to show that the attackers meant business. He was sent with a sample of explosives the terrorists planned to use if their demands were not met. This might not have been a wise idea, as Levy not only showed them the sample, but also described in full the situation aboard the aircraft, vitally explaining that the doors were not blocked. Under Moshe Dayan, Levy was instructed to return to the plane and tell the hijackers that Israel would agree to the terms and would begin to release the prisoners. This might sound like it was pretty easy for the Black September to get their demands met. But don't forget, this is Israel and they probably aren't going to give in that easy. Upon returning to the plane, the news was met by the hijackers rejoicing, further exciting them when over the radio a voice spoke in Arabic claiming to be a released prisoner. Moshe told the hijackers that the plane would be repaired and the released prisoners would shortly arrive at the airport to be transferred off to Cairo. However, all of this was a ruse and all a way of buying time to position Israeli special forces for a rescue attack. Later on in the day, bogus prisoners started to appear within sight of Flight 571 boarding an aircraft. In the hijackers' minds, everything was appearing to go to plan. So much so that they allowed the plane's doors to be opened to help with the midday sun beating down on the aircraft. Even more encouraging, 21 hours after the initial hijacking, two trucks carrying 18 men in white overalls pulled up to Sabena 571 and appeared to begin repairing the flat tyres. However, everything was not as it seemed. After milling around appearing to repair the plane, the 18 overall men burst into the aircraft through the emergency doors over the wings, opening fire as they went. Within 90 seconds, the two male hijackers lay dead. The overall men were part of the elite commando unit, Sariyat Matkal, led by Ehud Barak, and included Benjamin Netanyahu, both future prime ministers. Several inside the plane would be injured, including one woman who would later die of her wounds. Netanyahu was also injured in his bicep. The two surviving hijackers were arrested, with Teresa Hausa injured and Rima Tanios left relatively unscathed. Both the hijackers were later convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, only to be exchanged in 1983 after the Lebanon War for Israeli prisoners. Captain Levy insisted on flying the 707 back to Belgium and would continue to fly until his retirement in 1981. Living in Dover with his wife, who also survived 571. His wife Dora passed away in 2005 and Reginald died in 2010 at the age of 88. His bravery during the hijacking was not out of character, as he was a veteran of World War II and the Berlin airlift. The 707 would carry on to serve Sabena for another 5 years, ironically being sold off to the Israeli military for use as a spy plane. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment below. If you haven't done so already, I'd always appreciate it if you subscribed, and don't forget to click the bell icon to keep up to date. I also have a Patreon if you fancy supporting the channel financially. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. This seemingly harmless ball for the uninitiated looks like any old piece of metal. A cannonball or a small wrecking ball maybe. But if you had the misfortune to handle this incorrectly, you would most certainly have a painful and horrible death. Sadly, 2 people had such an experience, and more would die prematurely of cancer over subsequent decades. And arguably, the 2 incidents showed how you can't take for granted a material with the potential of going supercritical at the drop of a hat. Unsurprisingly, the item in question would gain the name the Demon Core. But what was this innocuous looking item? This subject has been covered before by someone I know, but I found this story really interesting and I had to do a video about it. I've included the link in the video description if you'd like to check it out once you finish watching this video. Like many of my atomic videos, our story starts during the Second World War and the Manhattan Project. The Demon Core, or Rufus as it was originally nicknamed, was intended to be used in a 3rd atomic bomb to be dropped on Japan, a weapon that was never needed. On the 15th of August, Japan surrendered after 2 atomic bombs being detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The core was similar to the one used in the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki, consisting of 3 pieces, 2 plutonium-gallium hemispheres separated by a ring. The plutonium core was refined and hot-pressed into its ominous spherical shape at Hanford and shipped to the Los Alamos laboratory for preparation for use in an implosion-type bomb. Once assembled, it was designed to be 5% below critical mass, leaving the core somewhat safe. However, 5% was to ensure that when needed it could be used to make a very large explosion easily. But one deadly side effect was that this left very little margin for error. You see, once the core went critical, it would be in a perfect state of equilibrium, no increase or decrease in power. However, one in many different factors could send the core into supercriticality, creating and sustaining a chain reaction, until it either settled at a new criticality level and increased power, or explode. Needless to say, both outcomes would be a bit of a bad thing. The scientists at the Manhattan Project found themselves with this surplus piece of weapons-grade material, and they did what most scientists would do, study and push the boundaries. However, some of the experiments were outright reckless, and this leads us to the core's first victim. Harry Daghlian, a 24-year-old physicist from New London, Connecticut, was working on the core on the 21st of August 1945. Daghlian had been on the staff of the Manhattan Project since 1944, joining while still a graduate student. On the fateful day, Daghlian was making a neutron reflector around the core of tungsten carbide. A neutron reflector, funnily enough, is designed to reflect neutrons back into a subcritical mass, making the material critical. It can also increase nuclear fission a critical mass is capable of. The neutron reflector experiment was being performed alone, apart from Private Robert J. Hemmerly, who was sat behind a desk 4 meters away on guard duty. Whilst undertaking the experiment, Daghlian noticed that the addition of a final tungsten brick would render the core supercritical. He withdrew the brick with his hand, in doing so accidentally dropping it onto the pile. This was all that was needed for the core to go prompt critical. Immediately he tried to remove the brick by knocking it off and was unsuccessful. Instead he quickly disassembled the pile, but by this time he had absorbed 510 REM of neutron radiation. His fate was sealed. He received intensive care but would fall into a coma and pass away 25 days after the incident. The first known death linked to a criticality accident. His hand shown here had the skin burned off from the event. Daglin's body was transported back to New London to be buried in Cedar Grove. The tragic accident that led to Daglin's death sparked a review of safety regulations within the project. One of the major changes was that any similar experiment would require 2 personnel and 2 instruments capable of monitoring and alerting neutron counts. These new rules put in place were thought to reduce the risk of a criticality accident. However, this would not be the case when it came to the soon-to-be nicknamed Demon Core. Just 9 months would go by until the core experienced its second criticality accident during an experiment nicknamed Tickling the Dragon's Tail, so named due to the apparent disregard to standard safety practices. Louis Slotin was a 35-year-old Canadian physicist and chemist, having worked on the Manhattan Project since 1942. He worked on experiments with uranium and plutonium cores to assess their critical mass amount. Needless to say, he was experienced, but possibly he had become complacent. Slotin had become quite the showman when doing experiments, and this had not changed leading up to his planned exit from the Manhattan Project. Slotin had become increasingly unhappy in his involvement in the project. However, he could not leave until a replacement had been trained up. He had been quoted saying, "I am one of the few people left here who are experienced bomb putter togetherness." After leaving the project, Slotin had planned to return to teaching. This brings us to the 21st of May 1946, and at around 3 p.m, Slotin was preparing to demonstrate an experiment to his replacement, 36-year-old Alvin C. Graves. The experiment would involve 2 spheres of beryllium. The 2 parts put together around the core would create a neutron reflector, and the experiment was used to create one of the first steps in a fission reaction. One half of the beryllium sphere had a small hole in the top of it to allow an operator to hold onto it to enable manual lowering, and shims were used to prevent the 2 halves from touching, which would cause a criticality accident. The shims made a rudimentary, albeit effective method of protection. However, Slotin had developed a unique modification to the experiment. He, instead of using shims, would use a single flat blade screwdriver to separate the 2 half spheres, meaning that during an experiment both hands of the operator would be used, one holding the top half via the hole with their thumb, and the other spacing the sphere with the tip of the screwdriver. Slotin had done the experiment in this fashion several times to observers, even reportedly prompting Enrico Fermi to tell Slotin that he'd be dead within a year if he carried on using this dangerous method. So well known was the danger of using a screwdriver that the experiment got the nickname Tickling the Tail of the Dragon. I think we can see where this is going. During the experiment, around 3:20 p.m, the inevitable happened as the flathead screwdriver slipped in Slotin's right hand, causing the top half sphere to close over the core. The core went supercritical, causing the air around it to ionise, making an eerie blue glow. The intense burst of neutron radiation was released into the room as Slotin experienced a sour taste in his mouth. Slotin's left hand started to burn, immediately causing him to throw his arm in the air, in doing so knocking off the top sphere onto the floor, ending the criticality incident, in total only lasting a couple of seconds. Slotin had prevented any further reaction, and his position over the core had inadvertently shielded the other occupants in the room, including Alvin, who had received a high but not deadly dose of radiation. However, this ensured that Slotin was not so lucky. Slotin vomited after leaving the laboratory and was immediately hospitalised. His body was covered in blisters and had experienced burns on some of his internal organs in what a doctor would describe as 3-dimensional sunburn. 7 days after exposure, Slotin experienced extreme mental confusion, and after his lips went blue, he was placed inside an oxygen tent, eventually slipping into a coma. He died of his exposure with his parents at his side after 9 days, despite having received intensive care. 3 other witnesses to the experiment would remain in hospital after Slotin's tragic death. Alvin Graves developed symptoms of acute radiation sickness, and although surviving, would live with chronic neurological and vision problems. He would continue to work in nuclear testing until his death in 1965 after a heart attack. One other personnel member would die around the same time as Graves of leukemia. However, it is impossible to tell for certain due to the Demon Core. Also, the guard on duty during Daghlian's experiment would die at the age of 62, also of leukemia. Sadly, the Core took the lives of two very talented scientists, but it just shows how deadly radiation can be and how complacency, even with the most skilled of operators, is not the most ideal thing around dangerous materials. The Core's destination was going to be intended for Operation Crossroads after the experiments. However, due to the slot-in criticality incident, some time was needed to re-evaluate the Core's effectiveness for use in a bomb. Ironically, it would be due to its criticality incidents that the Core would not be used for weapons detonation. Instead, it was melted down for use in other cores. Due to the criticality accidents, no more experiments would be done by hand, instead using remotely controlled machines, allowing the operator to be located in a safe room away from radiation. However, this would not completely remove casualties from criticality accidents, but they will be subjects for future videos. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like. If you have any suggestions for future videos, let me know in the comments. If you'd like to support the channel financially, then you're in luck, as I have a Patreon and the link is in the description. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. If you look on Google Maps just off the coast of the Isle of Sheppey in the Thames Estuary, you'll see a pin for a historical landmark with 17 reviews. However, you can't visit, not just because it's at sea, but because it's within an exclusion zone intended to protect London's Thames Estuary from an apocalyptic tsunami. This looming threat is called the SS Richard Montgomery, and there is at the moment nothing that can be done about it. The SS Richard Montgomery was a Liberty class of cargo ship built during the Second World War to transport weapons and goods for the US. The class of ship was originally a British concept for a cheap mass-produced cargo vessel, but was refined under the impressive industrial scale of 1940s America. By the end of the war, around 2,710 would be built, essentially making the vessel somewhat disposable. Understandable, as during the Battle of the Atlantic, freight vessel losses were unprecedented at the hands of the German U-boats. The SS Richard Montgomery was laid down at St. John's River Shipbuilding Company in Jacksonville, Florida, in March 1943, being launched in May the same year and being finished in July. Kind of shows how quickly these ships were being churned out. Displacing 14,474 tonnes with a length of 128.8 metres, she sported 2 oil-fuel steam engines and held a complement of 35 personnel. The ship was named after Irish soldier Richard Montgomery, who was killed during the American War for Independence. Roll on 1944 and the Richard Montgomery's final voyage. She was loaded with around 7,000 tonnes of munitions at Hog Island, Philadelphia, and under the command of Captain Willicke, her journey across the Atlantic was relatively uneventful, reaching the Thames Estuary later on in the month to form part of a convoy to Cherbourg. Under the orders of the King's Harbour Master from HMS Lee, which was not actually a ship but a commandeered Southend pier, she was ordered to drop anchor just off the coast of the North Sands of the Isle of Sheppey, around 1.5 miles from Sheerness, which is around here on a map. See, this is a bit of a mistake, as at the low tide the depth of the water was around 30 feet, and the Richard Montgomery drew just over 31 feet. I think we can see where this is going. In the early morning of the 20th of August, the Richard Montgomery was seen by lookouts on ships moored nearby, swinging towards the shoal. Warning sirens sounded by the ships were not heeded by Chief Officer on watch aboard the Richard Montgomery. No effort was made to even wake the captain to try and rectify the impending disaster. Soon enough, the ship was pushed onto the Sheerness Middle Sands, straining the vessel. Worse still, as the tide ebbed, the ship rested on the seabed, causing some of her plates to buckle under her own weight, cracking her hull, making gunshot sounds as rivets pinged out. Quickly, life rafts were released from the Richard Montgomery as the crew took their chance to escape the stranded ship, kind of understandably, as who would want to be on board a potential bomb as it starts to break open. Sat stranded on the sands, the earliest time she could be refloated would be in a whopping 2 weeks' time, and even then only if most of the cargo was removed. A Rochester-based company was drafted in to unload the dangerous cargo from the Richard Montgomery, and works began on the 23rd, making use of her own unloading machinery. Just 1 day later would see the hull crack, allowing some of the ship to flood. Even though the ship was breaking up, salvage efforts carried on right the way into September, eventually being abandoned on the 25th. Around 1,400 tons of munitions remained on board the stranded and half-sunken ship. In an inquest into the accident, Captain Willicke was acquitted of any blame due to not being aware of running aground because of being asleep. Most of the blame was laid at the feet of the harbour master. Now fast forward to today, how much risk does the Richard Montgomery pose on London right now? So Mrs. Plainly and I decided to go to the Isle of Sheppey so you don't have to, in an attempt to see the SS Richard Montgomery in the flesh. Well, as you can see, we went on a bit of a road trip in vain, as you can only see what might be the ship's mast in the distance. This was due to a bit of fog on what was an otherwise sunny day. So the wreck is at a depth of 15 metres, leaning to a starboard side. It is thought that she still holds 286 £2,000 high explosive bombs, 4,439 £1,000 bombs, 1,925 £500 bombs, 2,815 fragmentation bombs and bomb clusters, as well as other various flares, charges and fuses. Because of the amount of ordnance still sitting in the Thames estuary, an exclusion zone was placed around the wreck in 1973, as surveys had suggested that detonation could be caused by a collision, obviously something you don't want. This then leads us to the question of why hasn't the mess of the Richard Montgomery been cleaned up? Seeming bizarre choice of doing nothing might sound odd, but there is a genuine fear of detonation caused by any cleanup works. This fear is based on a 1967 cleanup effort of a Polish munitions ship sunk off the coast of Folkestone in 1946. The recovery works set off the munitions aboard, creating an explosion measuring 4.5 on the Richter scale, creating a 6-metre deep crater on the seabed. It was thought that the amount of explosives were around a quarter of that on board the Richard Montgomery. It is thought that if the Richard Montgomery were to detonate, a 1,000 feet wide column of debris and water would be launched 10,000 feet into the air, also creating a 16 feet high tidal wave. Although it wouldn't create as much devastation as the Halifax explosion, damages could run into the millions, as the Thames estuary is one of the busiest shipping lanes in Western Europe. To add insult to injury, leaving the wreck itself is a dead-end option as well, due to the explosives on the ship herself becoming more unstable over time. The copper in the explosives has caused concern, as it can react with the lead, creating copper azide, a deadly and sensitive explosive. This worry has been somewhat debunked by the Maritime Agency, saying, as the fuses will probably have been flooded for many years and the sensitive compounds referred to are soluble in water, this is no longer considered to be a significant hazard. But the use of the word probably doesn't give the highest level of confidence. I'll leave it up to you guys and gals to decide on that. It was predicted in a 2012 report that if she were to explode, then a smaller tidal wave of around 1 metre would emit from the epicentre. Although not catastrophic, it could still flood many places on the estuary, which, needless to say, if you live there, would be pretty bad. Although you can't visit the stranded vessel, you can visit some of her reviews online, which are rather amusing to say the least. Pretty much, the explosive situation has turned into a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Good job they never ended up building that airport there. The last month has been crazy. We just hit 50,000 subscribers, and thank you all so much for your support. I'm thinking of doing a Q&A to celebrate this, so submit any questions in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and share it. It really helps spread the awareness of the channel. I've also dug out my rarely used Twitter, which I'll be posting random facts regularly from now on. Also, if you'd like to support the channel financially, I've got a Patreon and all the links are in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. If I asked you to think of an arms race winning weapon from the Soviet Union, a capitalist destroying super device may come to mind, like the Tsar Bomba. However, this formidable West annihilation machine I'm thinking of actually would end up making more of a headache for the East and would tragically take the lives of many Soviet naval personnel. If you're a regular Plainly Difficult viewer, you'll probably know I like covering completely avoidable incidents, and the K-19 submarine is no exception. This K submarine is not the same type that I've covered before that were involved in the Battle of May Island. Instead, it was a Cold War era Soviet vessel. K-19 was the first of a class of Soviet nuclear-powered and armed submarines, known as Project 658, made during the 1950s. The Hotel class, as they were known to NATO, were intended to even out the playing field with the USA in submarine development by creating the Soviet Union's first nuclear-fueled and armed fleet. The Soviet Union had been using nuclear-powered subs with the first called K3 of Project 627 from June of 1958, which was used as an attack vessel. The Soviet Navy did have nuclear-armed submarines under Project 629 from 1958 as well. Pretty much, the K-19 would be a combination of the two classes to make one superweapon, but we'll talk about her design in a little bit. The US Navy had fielded the world's first nuclear-powered submarine in 1955, called the Nautilus. The addition of a nuclear reactor to a submarine revolutionised naval combat, as essentially meant that the only limit to a vessel's endurance was the amount of food on board for the crew. This was due to the fact that noisy, polluting and air-consuming diesel generators were not needed to charge the submarine's batteries, meaning that the sub didn't have to surface to allow air in and exhaust fumes out. The deletion of the need to surface made a nuclear-powered submarine much harder to detect, allowing the deployment of SLBMs, or submarine launched ballistic missiles, under the nose of an unsuspecting enemy. This immediately gave the upper hand to the USA, as most atomic weapons at the time were to be dropped from easy to target and destroy bomber planes. The new submarine design boasted an endurance of 60 days at sea, limited by food, a top speed of 26 knots submerged, two 70 megawatt reactors, a crew of 125, and a submerged displacement of 5,080 tons. She was armed with conventional torpedoes with 6 tubes forward and 2 aft. The design also had to take the freshly developed R-13 SLBMs intended to rival the US Polaris A-1 missiles. The new vessel was powered by 2 VM pressurised water reactors, using 20% enriched uranium-235 and outputting 70 megawatts. The whole project was a rush job from start to finish, with the class being based on the design of the Project 627 vessels, with the additional missile compartment added behind the sail. The missile section was a derivative version from another type of sub, the Golf-class Soviet diesel-powered vessel, known to the Soviets as Project 629. A newer D2 launch system would be utilised instead of the D1 in Project 629. Recycling a design is only really a good idea if the thing you're copying is good, but the 627 was riddled with issues, and sticking two questionable designs together would probably not be the best idea. The new sub had to surface to fire her ballistic missiles, however the D2 system allowed this to be done within 12 minutes. Pretty impressive. Essentially the project was a cut and paste job, and it would come to bite the Navy in the behind. The K-19 was laid down on the 17th of October 1958 at Severodvinsk State Shipyard 402 in Russia. Construction of the submarine was anything but smooth, with 2 workers dying in a fire during the works and 6 more killed by fumes whilst fitting a cistern. The death toll didn't stop there, as another worker was crushed to death whilst loading on one of her missiles, and another died by falling between 2 compartments. It would seem that K-19 didn't have a very lucky start to life, with 10 deaths linked to the vessel even before her first mission. Due to the rush in construction, many parts of the vessel suffered from shoddy workmanship, which will come to haunt her in the future. If all the construction deaths linked to the ship wasn't bad luck enough, during her christening on the 8th of April 1959, tradition was ignored, with a man instead of a woman break the champagne across the ship's stern. Even that didn't go to plan, as the bottle bounced off the rubber coating of the vessel, viewed as bad luck to traditionally superstitious sailors. Captain First Rank Nikolai Zatiev was given the keys to the new superweapon as sea trials begun. Early life for the K-19 was, as you would expect, ropey, with her reactor being damaged from incorrect operation on the 19th of January 1960. The accident occurred from confusion during a shift handover, resulting in a control rod being bent. The damage meant that the reactor had to be rebuilt, which is a bit worrying that damage could have been done in the first place, as improper functioning of control rods is not a great thing. During the sea trials in July and between the 12th of August and 8th of November, the crew noticed after travelling just over 10,000 miles that most of her rubber coating on the vessel had stripped away. And during a 300-metre test dive, flooding was reported in the reactor room caused by a defect, leaving the sub to list to one side. Then, to add insult to injury, crew members tried to flush some wood into the waste system, causing it to flood one of the ship's compartments by a third. So by the time the sea trials had ended, she needed new coating and some remedial repairs, replacing a poorly fitted gasket. In December 1960, a water pump failed in the cooling system, meaning K-19 had to be fixed at sea. Unsurprising, the dumpster fire of development gave the ship a terrible reputation for luck. However, K-19 finally made it into commission on the 30th of April 1961. In all, a total turnaround time from laydown to finish of just under 3 years. Pretty impressive, especially if you compare it to, say, the good old British Astute class development cycle. K-19 entered service with a complement of 139 men, including everyone needed to run the vessel, as well as specialist observers, which were probably needed given the vessel and the crew's track record for incidents. All of the accidents so far, although bad, probably wouldn't be remembered outside of the USSR. However, it was the next part of her story that would make the K-19 go down in infamy just over 2 months after her commissioning. On the 4th of July 1961, K-19 was taking part in exercises off the coast of Greenland, still under the command of Captain Zatiev. At 4:15 am, the vessel developed a fault with the reactor cooling system. The failure was caused by a leak, dropping the system's pressure to zero. This in turn sent the reactor's temperature soaring. Immediately, the reactor's scram system was activated, inserting the control rods into the core. However, the temperature carried on rising. To add insult to injury, K-19 was unable to contact Moscow due to her long-range radio system being damaged in an earlier accident. With no help from Moscow, Zatiev took matters into his own hands and ordered the ship's engineers to make a completely new cooling system for the reactor. Needless to say, this is rather an unorthodox request. Such an order would expose his crew to dangerous levels of radiation, as the repair would involve opening the sealed reactor room. The engineering team worked in the deadly conditions but bravely followed orders. The 8-man team, 7 engineers and their divisional officer, received a high dose of radiation, but had managed to rig up an improvised cooling system by using an air vent valve and welding it to a water supply pipe. The new reactor modification worked in bringing down the reactor's temperature. However, radioactive steam had circulated throughout the vessel via the ventilation system. Large parts of the submarine had been contaminated, including some of her ballistic missiles. Every member of the crew received a dose of radiation, although in varying amounts. K-19 was in a dangerous predicament. Cut off from contacting the USSR and limping, Captain Zatiev decided to change course and sail on a heading to meet with some conventionally powered diesel submarines to the south. Due to the effect and fear of radiation sickness, Zatiev feared a mutiny and ordered most of the ship's small arms to be thrown aboard, with a few weapons kept back for the captain and trusted crew members. Needless to say that the situation aboard the damaged sub must have been excruciating. Soviet submarine S-270 picked up K-19's low-power radio calls and managed to arrange to meet the damaged vessel. However, someone else was listening. A US destroyer also picked up the distress calls and offered to help, which sounds like a case of good Samaritanism, and it most likely was, but also had the benefit of gaining possession of a brand new Soviet weapons system. Fearing this, Zatiev refused the help and sailed towards the S-270. Upon reaching the diesel sub, Zatiev evacuated his crew and arranged for the K-19 to be towed to a friendly port. By the 10th of July 1961, K-19 made it to Polyamy near Murmansk. Repair works would take 2 years, contaminating many more workers and an area of 700 metres around K-19 in the port. To add to the radioactive cherry to the pretty environmentally killing cake, the Navy disposed of the vessel's reactor room by dumping it into the Kara Sea. Between the 10th and 25th of July 1961, the 8-man engineering team succumbed to the deadly dose of radiation they received whilst working on the makeshift cooling system. Each man received between 7.5 and 54 sieverts of radiation. It is thought that if you receive over 5 SV, then your outlook on life would be very short. Another 14 crew members would die before the 2-year repair time of the K-19 was up, and many more of the crew would contract cancer, kidney issues and chest pains for life. All of the dead from the radiation incident were buried in lead coffins, but the family members were not notified of the reason. Some recognition of the dangers the crew experienced on board the contaminated sub, 26 members were decorated for courage and valour for their actions. The official reason for the cooling system failure was put down to a welding error during manufacture, where a worker had failed to protect a cooling pipe from unwanted welding sparks, leading to a spark falling on one of the exposed pipes, making a microscopic crack that would over time and pressure cause the damage to fail. You might think that, due to the damage aboard the vessel, that its service life would be reduced or even scrapped, but no, K-19 would continue to see active duties all the way up until 1990. She would gain the dark nickname of Hiroshima and would continue to experience bad luck. In 1969 she would collide with USS Gato in the Barents Sea, luckily with no fatalities. The bad luck would still carry on into the 1970s as she would experience 2 fires in 1972 in February and November, one of which killing 28 crew members. She would be finally taken out of service in 1990, eventually being towed to Murmansk to be scrapped in 2002, ending a long and deadly career, but not for the reason she was designed for. Captain Zatev carried on in the Navy until retirement in 1986, passing away from lung disease in 1998 at the age of 72. He was buried in Moscow next to some of his crew from the K-19. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like. If you have any suggestions for future videos, let me know in the comments. If you'd like to support the channel financially, then you're in luck as I have a Patreon and a link is in the description. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching. I've covered 2 out of 4 of the International Nuclear Event Scale Level 5 incidents on this channel. One of the 2 left is very well known and will be a future video, however the subject for today is much less known. It was a tragic story of negligence and shows how much damage can be done if the public unknowingly come into contact with radioactive materials. The event would leave parts of a city contaminated, 4 dead, a further 249 irradiated, and another 112,000 people needing to be examined. The event would be called by the Times as one of the worst nuclear incidents in history. And it wouldn't happen in the UK, USSR or the USA, but instead late 1980s Brazil. In a controlled and protected environment such as a hospital full of trained staff, a teletherapy unit poses little to no danger to the public. This is because said trained staff know how to properly operate and maintain a machine that uses a radioactive material. Many hospitals and treatment centres use such machinery in the treatment of cancer, and the beginning of the Goiânia incident starts in such an establishment. In 1985, 1 kilometre away from the administrative centre of Goiânia, is at the Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia, a private radiotherapy centre that had been closed down. The company moved to a new premises, taking a Cobalt-60 teletherapy unit with them. However, the move left behind a Cesium-137 unit. This was against the Institute's licence with the licensing authority. After the closure of the centre, the ownership of the property came into dispute. However, a seemingly unnoteworthy situation of 2 organisations arguing over abandoned property and its contents would put the piece of equipment into dangerous waters. This was because the IGR was refused entry to the site while the argument was litigated, in doing so not allowing the unit to be removed and placed in a safe lest abandoned environment. During the dispute, the Court of Goiânia noted on the 11th of September 1986 that it was aware of the equipment and its radioactive contents left at the property. Due to the lack of entry granted to IGR owner Carlos Figueiredo in 1987 to retrieve items left in the abandoned property, several letters were sent to the National Nuclear Energy Commission warning of potential issues for storing radioactive materials in an abandoned building. After the abandonment of the building, it became partially demolished, leaving the teletherapy unit unsecured. The sorry state of the property led to vagrants regularly entering to search for scrap materials to sell and for shelter. Needless to say, this is not a good thing. The city of Goiânia in the 1980s had a population of around 1 million. First of all, let's talk about the equipment that could get into the wrong hands that was worrying the owner of IGR so much in the first place. The unit, purchased in 1977, was a model Cesapan F3000 designed by Brazetti and Company of Milan, Italy in the 1950s. The machine used a sealed source capsule to house the cesium-137, made of lead and stainless steel, set inside a source wheel with a rotating shutter mechanism. To provide a beam for use, the shutter was turned electrically to align the source capsule with the radiation aperture. To be fail-safe, the mechanism used a spring to return the shutter to its off position after exposure, or in the case of a power failure. The whole assembly was designed to be able to be dismantled, but only with specialist tools. The source was thought to have been manufactured at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in around 1970. The source was cesium-137 in the form of a soluble salt, and the sealed capsule was of an international standard size. By the time 1987 had come round, the value of the machine had become common knowledge in the local area. Roberto dos Santos Alves had heard such rumours and encouraged Wegener Monta Pieria to join him on the 13th of September to illegally enter the old IGR site with the intention to dismantle the F3000 unit. However, the two only took with them basic tools. After some wrangling with the unit's rotating assembly, the duo managed to set it free from the machine. The assembly, being made of stainless steel, was shiny and looked valuable, and because of this, they loaded it into a wheelbarrow and proceeded to take it half a kilometre to Alves' house. It is not known whether during the dismantling if the pair received a beam of radiation at the disused clinic. However, a later investigation would show no contamination at the site, meaning they hadn't damaged the capsule whilst removing it from the machine. At Alves' house that evening, the mechanism was dismantled, leading to both men feeling sick. However, they thought this was due to something they ate and continued to work on the assembly. The next day, Pieria felt dizzy as well as vomiting. His left hand also began to swell up, and on the same hand a burn started to develop in the same shape and size as the exposure aperture. By this time, at least one of the men had received a direct beam of radiation during their dismantling efforts. The next part of the video is based on the International Atomic Agency's timeline of events. On the 15th of September, Pieria went to the local clinic to seek medical help. He was diagnosed with an allergic reaction caused by bad food. He received advice to stay in and try to rest, only doing light work if necessary. Needless to say, this diagnosis was a little bit off, but in the health professional's defence, radiation exposure isn't a very common complaint the average Brazilian would seek out medical advice for. By the 18th, on his own, Alves had placed the assembly under a mango tree. Over the preceding days, he had tried to work to remove the source wheel from the shutter. Whilst doing so, he punctured the thick window of the capsule with a screwdriver. He scooped out some of the radioactive material. Bizarrely, he tried to light it as he thought it might have been gunpowder. At this point, it might be obvious that the men weren't aware of how this type of machinery worked and the danger that they had put themselves in. By the end of the day, he had managed to successfully remove the wheel from the shutter. Here enters the next person to handle the seemingly harmless yet deadly scrap of metal. Devere Ferreira, a local scrapyard owner, bought the capsule off of Alves. Later on in the evening, he found the puncture left by Alves showing an eerie glow. Thinking that it must be valuable or possibly ghostly, Ferreira took it from the yard into his home to show his family. Fieria's wife, Gabriella, examined the strange item. For 3 days, Fieria invited friends and neighbours over to look at the source. On the 21st, De Vere and a friend managed to exhume rice-sized grains of cesium-137. However, they quickly turned to powder. After this, both De Vere Fieria and his friend gave out the powder to friends and family. They were unknowingly spreading a deadly contaminant amongst their community. Even scarier is that some of the recipients of the powder added it to their skin, using it as a glitter. Over the coming days, De Vere's wife started to show similar symptoms to Fieria, and again after a visit to the doctor resulted in a diagnosis of allergy caused by some dodgy food. Obviously again, this was a fatal misunderstanding of the patient's complaints. By the 23rd, Gabriella was sent home to rest and was joined by her mother to help her recover. On the 24th, De Vere's brother Ivo received some of the powder and took it to his house down the road. Ivo placed the mysterious powder on the floor and his daughter Lydie played with it, putting it on her skin. With contaminated hands, she ate a sandwich, unknowingly consuming some of the sauce. Tragically, this would be over a fatal dose. By the 25th, a scrap metal capsule changed hands once again to another scrapyard. And a day later, more parts of the teletherapy unit were taken from the abandoned IGR site, although what was taken was mainly scrap shielding. Now, with most of her family showing some signs of sickness since exposure to the powder, Gabriella collected up as much of the broken up capsule as she could from both scrapyards and put the pieces into a plastic bag. She then took a bus to Vigilancia Sanitaria on 16th Street on the 28th. A couple of people who were exposed were also taken to the Vigilancia Sanitaria. Initially, the health workers, confused by the symptoms of the group of people, thought the case of sickness was from a tropical disease. However, one of the doctors recognised some of the patient's lesions as a symptom of some kind of radiation exposure. One of the doctors also recognised some of the scrap metals as possibly from X-ray equipment. Because of this, they thought extra investigation was needed and a medical physicist be sourced to test the mystery contents of the plastic bag. On the morning of the 29th, a medical physicist arrived with a scintillation counter. Oddly, it was his second meter, as the original one that he had borrowed from the nearby Nuclear Brazil offices gave a reading in all directions, quite a distance from the Vigilancia Sanitaria. Assuming it was defective, he took the original meter back and took a replacement. However, the meter was not defective. Upon using his second meter of the day, the magnitude of the contamination was apparent. The scrapyard that Alves had sold the capsule to was checked for contamination and was shown on scanners as way too high, and the Fierias were evacuated. By the end of the day, the police, fire brigade, local and national government were very much aware of the situation. Over the next few days, certain areas in the neighbourhood were cordoned off by officials as the full scale of contamination was established. The list of contaminated areas ended up being pretty vast and included the abandoned IGR facility. Although no contamination was found, it was the known source of the radioactive materials and was treated as dangerous. Roberto dos Santos' house on Rua 57, De Vere Fieria's scrapyard on Rua 15A, Ivo Fieria's house on 1F, Rua 6, the junkyard that received the capsule after the 25th, Vigilancia Sanitaria, several more houses, 14 cars, 3 buses and 5 pigs. Every resident in the area was removed and triaged and checked for contamination. In addition, 112,000 people were screened, of which 249 were found to have been contaminated. The most contaminated was sent to the Olympic Stadium on the 30th of September, totaling 22 possible people showing signs of radiation sickness. Most of the people were either relatives, friends or workers at both junkyards, all of whom were externally contaminated with cesium-137. Some of the worst cases were flown to Rio de Janeiro for specialist care. The IAEA investigation goes into great detail of the medical treatment for the victims, and if I covered it all of this in this video, then it would be way too long. The report is really worth a read, and the link for it is in the description. We'll go to the victims later on in the video. As October rolled in, several key areas for the cleanup were surveyed using a helicopter with detectors mounted to it, and with a car also fitted with detectors. Another car was used throughout the wider city to highlight any other contaminated areas. The problem with the cesium-137 was that it was a powder and was water soluble, meaning contamination could find its way into virtually anywhere. Due to the large amount of radioactive waste a clean-up effort would produce, the disposal site was earmarked 20 kilometres away from Goiânia, near Abadia de Goiás. Most of October would be spent planning the clean-up efforts. A target date of the 21st of December was set by the government so that residents and workers could return home for Christmas. The clean-up team had a few tough weeks ahead. 250 technical staff, supported by 300 workers, headed up the main cleaning efforts. 7 houses were deemed too contaminated to rescue and were demolished, with the rubble sent to the disposal site. In total, 85 houses were found to have some form of contamination present. The least contaminated properties were dealt with first, as all the contents inside had to be removed and placed in an uncontaminated area for monitoring. Any safe items were wrapped in plastic, and any remaining items were either cleaned or disposed of. Everything from clothes, photos to toys had to be checked. Once all the items inside the house were checked, the entire property was vacuum cleaned to remove any contaminated dust. Any paint that was deemed to have been exposed was stripped off walls, and all floors were washed with an acid-based cleaning solution. The houses' roofs were jet washed, and 2 houses had to have their roofs completely removed due to the high levels of contamination. If any property had fruit-bearing plants, then the produce would be disposed of and all trees were pruned. A further 45 public places were contaminated in the area and received varying levels of clean-up efforts depending on the exposure. Topsoil in all of the contaminated areas was removed and placed in industrial drums for disposal. Varying depths of soil was removed depending on the radiation levels, and some 30mm of new topsoil was added. The worst area of contamination was the property that the capsule was originally punctured in, meaning cleanup crews could only work for a limited time at the epicentre. The site was the last to be decontaminated and was the biggest challenge. After weeks of 12-hour shifts, the December deadline was met for most of the major cleanup efforts. After Christmas, the affected areas were surveyed and any extra decontamination that was needed was undertaken. In total, around 3,500 metres squared of waste was generated that was disposed of, with 275 lorry loads sent to the disposal site. The environmental cleanup efforts took up a lot of resources, and not all the contamination was stopped quick enough. However, the most tragic part of the event was the human cost. In all, 4 people lost their lives in the Goiânia accident, and more would face lifelong injuries, both mental and physical. The first victims were 6-year-old Lady and Gabriela on the 23rd of October. Next was 22-year-old Israel Baptista dos Santos. On the 27th, he had been exposed working at De Vere's scrapyard whilst trying to extract lead from the source capsule. Finally was 18-year-old Admilson Alves de Souza on the 28th, also an employee of De Vere Ferreira. His exposure was from working on the source as well. De Vere Ferreira survived the incident, although he received a very high dose of radiation. However, he would die in 1994 due to depression and a drinking problem. The Goiânia incident shows how easy it was for an almost uncontrollable radiological accident to unfold. Sadly, the whole event was completely avoidable, as proper stewardship of a potentially dangerous piece of equipment would have never allowed the theft of the source in the first place, and the victims of the accident were completely unknowing of the dangers that they encountered. Teletherapy machines are vital in the fight against cancer and shows a great leap forward in patient treatment. Many lives are saved each year by the type of equipment involved in the Goiânia incident, and it's sad that such a machine designed to save life ultimately ended for, although not the machine's fault, but the fault of poor management by its owners. 3 of the owners of the IGR were charged with criminal negligence, but were ultimately left off. However, they were ordered to pay a fine for the condition of the building that housed the machine. Hello everyone, and thank you very much for watching the video. This is just a quick little plug. I've just launched a Teespring storefront, so if you fancy having any one of these t-shirts that are now flashing up on the screen, then please go ahead and buy them. It helps out the channel. And to celebrate this, there is a 25% off discount code in the description of the video. Thank you very much to my patrons listed here. If you'd like to become a Patreon for the Plainly Difficult channel, then check out the link for my Patreon page in the description as well. If you like the video, please leave a like, share the video as well if you'd like to show your friends, and if you have any suggestions for future videos or would like to discuss this video in particular, leave a comment in the section below. And all I have to say is thank you very much for watching. It may be hard to imagine, but there was once a time when, for seemingly no reason at all, that a whole neighbourhood could get ill and drop dead. For many people living in the 1800s London, this was an actual day-to-day reality, and scarily there seemed to be no way to stop it. However, one particular outbreak of cholera in 1854 would change the way scientists look at disease as a whole, and strangely enough, beer would be the catalyst. London in 1854 was a pretty disgusting place. People flooded into the inner city from the provinces and caused a waste disposal issue. The infrastructure for sewage made by Joseph Basil Gett had not yet come to fruition. Due to no proper alternative for disposal, human and animal waste was either dumped into the Thames, into homemade cesspits, or out onto the street. Areas like Soho suffered from overcrowding, and the primitive sewer system struggled, meaning that the area was a breeding ground of disease and infection. To add salt into the wound, science hadn't quite cracked the way to prevent cholera, mainly due to the leading theory of the disease. And whilst we're on the subject, let's talk about that particular popular theory. The theory of bad air causing disease harks its history all the way back to ancient China. The miasma theory posed that rotting organic matter created poisonous vapours that would infect any victim that came into contact with it. The theory was used to explain the Black Death. The presence of miasma was thought to be identifiable by a foul smell. Interestingly, pollution and poisonous air is actually dangerous, especially in built-up urbanised areas. I mean, just look at this dust mask that I wore on my commute every day for a month. Rotten organic matter and bad smells can be indicators of things you shouldn't be around if you value your health. So the theory does have one lightly placed foot in reality. However, the miasma theory was attached to seemingly unlinked diseases, like in our case cholera, but also plague and even chlamydia. Even obesity was linked to the theory by inhaling the fumes off of food. Pretty much miasma was used to explain a lot of the unknown when it came to health conditions. Conversely, the efforts to reduce miasma did actually lead to a healthier environment indirectly, as local governments' attempts to fight the vicious air actually involved improving sanitary conditions as well as just general cleanliness. Roll on 165 years ago today, or at least the date I'm recording this script, the 31st of August 1854, and a major outbreak of cholera in Soho after several years of outbreaks in other parts of London. Within 3 days, at least 127 residents of Broad Street lay dead from the outbreak, and by the 10th of September, the victim count rose to 500. Many victims were treated by Florence Nightingale at Middlesex Hospital, only a few months before she went to the Crimean War, a place where she would be known as the Lady with the Lamp. Soho, within a week of the outbreak, saw many residents flee the area. Now, never needing an excuse for a day out, Mrs. Plainly and I went to Broad Street, now called Broadwick Street, to have a look around so you don't have to. So far, so normal for Victorian era London, at least during 1849 to 1854. The worst years of the cholera outbreaks. So what makes the Broad Street incident so important to history? Well, it's not a place, but a person who looked into the human tragedy that has cemented the incident in not only London, but world important, as it would be the key turning point in the development of epidemiology. This is where Dr. John Snow enters the scene, a long-time sceptic of the miasma theory. Snow in 1854 had a practice off of Thrift Street, not far from the epicentre of the outbreak. By this time, Snow was a well-respected doctor, having administered chloroform on Queen Victoria during the birth of her 8th child, Leopold George Duncan Albert, in 1853. Born in 1813 in York, Snow from an early age showed an interest in science and mathematics, starting a medical apprenticeship in 1827 at the young age of just 14. In 1832, he would encounter cholera for the first time, treating many victims of the disease, and in doing so, learning up close its effects and possible causes. In 1837, he began work in Westminster Hospital, London, becoming a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and the Royal College of Physicians in 1844 and 1850 respectively. From his previous experiences with the disease, Snow was pretty sceptical of the miasma theory and had begun to suspect the source of the outbreak was somehow linked to polluted water due to contact with a pump on Broad Street. As soon as the Broad Street incident started to become a full-scale outbreak, Snow set about to investigate the cause in an effort to prove or disprove his theory. Taken to the street with the help of Reverend Henry Whitehead, Snow interviewed local residents both at home and at hospital, asking them where they got their water from. Most people replied the pump on Broad Street. Several people who lived closer to other pumps had also transmitted the disease, but after interviewing friends and relatives of the victims, it was discovered that many preferred the water from the Broad Street pump. One bizarre case of a victim of the cholera outbreak was a widow in Hampstead, miles away from Soho. It was found that from an interview with the widow's son by Snow, who informed him that his mother had lived in Soho many years before and had liked the water from the pump. It was found out that she sent a servant down to Soho every few days to collect the water. Last time which such a journey was made was on the 31st of August. On the 7th of September, Snow went to the authorities of the St James's parish to tell them to remove the handle from the pump as an emergency prevention of further outbreak. The parish obliged as they would try anything to slow the rising death toll, but didn't exactly believe Snow's water transmitted theory, due to the whole miasma thing being prevalent. The epidemic started to subside, however it is not known whether the outbreak had already started to slow down before the handle was removed. Even though Snow had pinpointed the epicentre, he still didn't have enough proof to convince the local authorities what the cause of the outbreak was. This is where Snow's methodical way of working really shined. Over the summer of 1854, Snow revisited his study of the outbreak to try and prove his theory to his contemporaries. By comparing water companies' water in different areas of London, Snow saw an alarming coincidence. Many of the areas in London that were hit the hardest during the cholera epidemic were served by companies that pumped their water from the polluted Thames. The Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks Company had served the Soho area, and they had been pumping pretty much directly from the disgusting Thames, which was also the place that most cesspits were emptied into. Another company called the Lambeth Water Company had also been pumping from the Thames, and many areas they served had also shown high numbers of cholera-linked deaths. Further still, the New River Company pumped water from a different source and filtered out any obvious contaminants before providing to the areas they served. And unsurprisingly, their areas of operation had very few cholera-linked deaths. By the end of September, around 616 victims were claimed by the outbreak on Broad Street. Snow used dot maps to plot the area of the outbreak. No points for guessing where the epicentre was by looking at this map. The map showed that the closer to the Broad Street pump you were, the more likely you would have been to be infected. Snow's theory was starting to look, excuse the pun, watertight. However, there was an anomaly in the area. The workers at the Broad Street Brewery, flanked by New Street and Hopkins Street, did not present themselves to the hospital as infected. How could this have been the case? Well, it's the way in which beer is made unknowingly killed the cholera bacteria. If you've ever been camping and taken water from a river to drink, you might know why. The act of boiling and filtering water effectively kills most bacteria, and a key part of brewing beer is, unsurprisingly, boiling it. So how did no one from the brewery contract the disease? Well, it goes that one of the perks of working for the brewery was that each worker was given an allowance of beer each day, and the workers took it and drank it instead of water. This was a key indicator to Snow that water contamination was the cause of the outbreak. The handle for the pump was later replaced, but by then the outbreak had subsided. The local authorities then lost interest in Snow's theory, instead blaming the whole episode as a bout of bad air. Snow took his theory to the Board of Health, who unsurprisingly rejected his new radical theory. It wouldn't be until 1866 that Snow's results would gain some traction, with William Farr's, who was once an opponent to Snow's thinking's, research into an outbreak in Bromley by Bow. Unfortunately, Snow didn't get the chance to enjoy the recognition for his theory, as he passed away in 1858 from a stroke. However, the research he did would help to change the opinion of the propagation of the disease, as Snow's theories would be generally accepted after the development of germ theory in 1883 under the German Robert Koch. Later it would be found out that the Broad Street pump's well had been dug 900 centimetres from an old cesspit, and wastewater from used nappies had leaked into the pit. The nappies were from a baby that had contracted cholera from another source, and the cesspit had leaked into the well, hence causing the outbreak. Snow's legacy isn't hard to find, especially in Soho, with a fake pump in the place of the deadly original, right outside the aptly named John Snow pub. However, the area has changed since Snow's time, with the brewery now this building and obviously jam-packed London traffic. If you're in central London, it is definitely worth checking out, and why not pop into the pub to celebrate Snow's legacy with a cholera-beating pint. Hello, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me a like. Do you have any suggestions for future videos? Then let me know in the comments below. If you would like to have a Plainly D t-shirt, I now have a Teespring store. I also have a Patreon page if you fancy supporting the channel, and also I have a Twitter which I post random facts and other things that I find interesting. I look forward to seeing you on the next video, and all that's left to say is thank you for watching. I've mentioned the INES scale a few times on this channel, and some of you might be wondering what it is. Well, you've clicked on the right video if you do want to know. Now, this video is a short explanation of what it is and what the point of it is. The International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale, or INES for short, was developed in 1990 by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The scale was originally thought up to categorise certain events and accidents in nuclear power stations. However, its scope has been extended to any civil nuclear or radiological event. It is used, and I quote from the IAEA website, to communicate the safety significance of nuclear and radiological events to the public. Essentially, it is used in publications to convey extremely complex ramifications from incidents for the layperson. The scale is broken down into 7 numerical ratings from 1 to 7, which 1 being not bad, not good, 2...
Good Lord, what is happening
to that nuclear reactor?
Aurora Borealis? Aurora Borealis? Yes. That's it? No.
The scale is used for rating of events that release radioactive material into the environment and in the exposure of workers and the public. Each level is approximately 10 times worse than the level below it. The scale is not intended to be used for disaster management, as usually the rating is only attached to an incident well after the fact. This is due to the environmental impact can only truly be assessed over time. Case in point being Fukushima, that started out initially on a level 5, only to be raised to level 7 after the full incident was realised. The scale is further subdivided to accident, which is the top 4 categories, and incident, which is the bottom 3. To add another level of confusion, there's also a level 0. But for the point of this video, that basically covers all other non-safety significant incidents. The level on the scale is determined by considering 3 areas of impact. People and the environment, looks at the radiation doses to people close to the location of the event and the widespread unplanned release of radioactive material from an installation. Radiological barriers and control looks at events without any direct effect on people or the environment and only applied to major facilities. It covers high radiation levels confined within a facility because of an event. Depth in defence is similar to the above, as it looks at the events without direct impact on people or the environment, but also looks at failures of systems or procedures to prevent accidents. Each level has its own classification, so let's have a look. Level 1 is anomaly, Level 2 is incident, Level 3 is a serious incident, Level 4 is an accident with local consequences, Level 5 is an accident with wider consequences, Level 6 is a serious accident, and Level 7 is a major accident. Sellafield is the real winner in the scale as it features at least once in levels 1 to 5, which is bad for the environment but kinda good for this channel as it gives me plenty of future subjects for videos. I've already started chipping away at a couple of the levels on this scale and I've nearly completed all of level 5. The IAEA has developed the scale in cooperation with over 60 member states through their official INES officers. Now the scale isn't without criticism, mainly from the 2 accidents in level 7, Chernobyl and Fukushima, as both events were very serious but had very different implications for the wider environment. The scale is mainly used as an easy to use guide for the public, so isn't very scientific, which is its biggest criticism. Because of nuclear and radiological events being open to interpretation, it makes giving a number on the scale very difficult for classifying events. Now I hope this short little video helped explain what the INES scale is, and are there any of these incidents I should make a video on? Let me know in the comments below. Did you know you could gain access to plainly difficult videos before they're put up on the channel? Well, if you didn't, you can by becoming a Patreon supporter from just $1 a month. And from $3 a month, you can have your name up with these lovely people. For you guys who have watched this far, thank you for watching, and my next video will be on the 3 Mile Island. Now I've done my obligatory YouTuber advertising, all that's left to say is thank you for watching.